Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hello, my dear friends.
Could ruin your reputation and your posture could destroy your marriage prospects. We're talking about the bizarre, suffocating, and frankly exhausting etiquette rules that 1920s women had to follow. Rules so absurd they make modern dating advice look like absolute anarchy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this. A huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. Your ideas genuinely shape what we create here, and I'm grateful for it. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. And hey, the channels now live on Spotify too. Links in the description if you want to check it out. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise. Get comfortable. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it was really like to navigate daily life as a woman in the roaring 20s? Could you survive an era where crossing your ankles wrong was scandalous? Would you last a day in a corset that literally reshaped your organs? What did women do when a single misstep at a dinner party could brand them as unrefined forever? How did they manage to dance, laugh, and live under rules designed to make them smaller, quieter, and more digestible? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in 1925. You're wearing a dress that costs more than your rent. Your waist is cinched to the point of hypoxia, and you're already worried about whether you smiled too widely at breakfast. Good luck. Let's start with something simple. Your face, specifically your smile. In the 1920s, a woman's smile wasn't just an expression of joy. It was a calculated social maneuver that could either elevate or destroy your reputation. Smile too widely and you were unladylike, possibly even hysterical. Scandalous. Laugh too loudly. You might as well announce you were raised by wolves. The ideal smile was demure, restrained, a gentle upward curve of the lips that suggested pleasant thoughts, but never, ever enthusiasm. It was less, "I'm happy," and more, "I'm tolerating your presence with grace." Young girls were actually trained in proper smiling techniques. Etiquette books of the era dedicated entire chapters to facial expressions, complete with illustrations showing the difference between acceptable and vulgar smiles. The acceptable smile, sometimes called the Mona Lisa smile, involved barely parting the lips, keeping teeth completely hidden, and allowing just the slightest upturn at the corners of the mouth. Your eyes could sparkle, but only subtly. Too much eye involvement suggested you were flirting, which was acceptable only if you were married and smiling at your husband, or unmarried and smiling at a potential suitor under strict supervision. Behind these restrictions was absurd, but revealing. A wide smile supposedly made women look common because it was associated with working-class women who hadn't been trained in refined behavior. Showing teeth was considered animalistic, too physical, too honest. Laughing loudly suggested a lack of self-control, which in turn suggested other dangerous lacks of control. In the bizarre logic of 1920s etiquette, a woman who couldn't control her facial expressions couldn't be trusted to control her morals, her emotions, or her behavior. Your smile essentially was a promise of your overall propriety. Photographers of the era would actually coach women to hold a subtle smile for portraits, sometimes for minutes at a time. The result was those sepia-toned photographs where women look vaguely pleasant, but also slightly constipated, caught between the desire to appear happy and the fear of appearing too happy. It's like everyone was perpetually trying to suppress a sneeze while also conveying mild contentment. Compare this to men who could laugh heartily, slap their knees, grin broadly, and generally express joy without consequence. A man with a big smile was confident, successful, approachable. A woman with the same smile was unrefined, possibly loose, definitely suspicious. The double standard was so ingrained that women internalized it, policing their own expressions and those of other women. Mothers corrected daughters. Friends gently reminded friends. Everyone was watching everyone else's mouth, judging the angle of their joy. Modern comparison time. Imagine trying to navigate a first date where you had to constantly monitor your facial expressions. Someone tells a joke, hilarious, genuinely funny, but you can't laugh fully. You have to produce a gentle, closed-mouth chuckle that suggests you found it amusing without suggesting you found it too amusing. You're essentially trying to download happiness through a dial-up connection while everyone else is on high speed. Internet. Exhausting doesn't even begin to cover it, and heaven help you if you had naturally expressive features or, worse, a gap between your teeth. Dental gaps were considered particularly vulgar, proof that you came from peasant stock or didn't care enough about your appearance to do something about it. Never mind that orthodontics was expensive and often painful. If you had imperfect teeth, you'd better keep them hidden behind those properly pursed lips. Your smile wasn't yours. It belonged to society, to expectations, to a system designed to make sure women took up as little space as possible, even in expressions of happiness. If you thought slouching was just bad for your back, welcome to the 1920s, where your posture was a direct reflection of your moral character. Women were expected to sit, stand, and walk with their spines perfectly straight, shoulders back, chin level, like they were balancing invisible books on their heads at all times. Slouching suggested laziness, loose morals, or worse, that you didn't care what men thought of you. Etiquette manuals warned that a woman with poor posture would never attract a suitable husband, because apparently nothing says marriage material like a vertebral column that could double as a measuring stick. This obsession with posture started young. Girls as young as 5 were enrolled in deportment classes where they practiced walking with actual books on their heads, sitting with wooden boards strapped to their backs, and standing for extended periods without shifting weight from foot to foot. The goal was to internalize perfect posture until it became automatic, unconscious, permanent. By the time you were a teenager, you weren't thinking about your spine. You just existed in a perpetual state of rigid verticality. The reasoning, as always, was layered with class anxiety and moral panic. Good posture was associated with the upper classes who had the leisure time and resources to train their daughters properly. Slouching was what factory workers did after 12-hour shifts, what exhausted mothers did while nursing babies, what poor women did because they couldn't afford the corsets and undergarments that literally forced your body into acceptable positions. If you slouched, you were advertising your lower status, your lack of breeding, your general unworthiness. But here's where it gets medically horrifying. Maintaining this posture required serious physical intervention. Corsets, which were still common in the early 1920s, did more than just cinch waists. They forced the spine into an unnatural S-curve, pushing the chest forward and the hips back. Women who wore tight corsets from adolescence actually developed differently than those who didn't. Their ribs could become permanently deformed, their internal organs shifted, and their ability to breathe deeply was compromised. Also, they could stand up straight and signal their virtue. Walking was its own challenge. The ideal gait was smooth, gliding with minimal hip movement. You were supposed to move as though you were on wheels, not legs. Swaying hips suggested sexual availability. Your body literally had to move in ways that denied its own physicality. Etiquette books recommended practicing by walking with a ruler or stick held between your knees, forcing you to take small, controlled steps. The result was that shuffling, mincing walk you see in old films, where women look like they're perpetually on their way to a very formal funeral. Sitting required even more vigilance. You perched on the edge of your chair, back straight, feet together, hands folded in your lap. Leaning back suggested you were getting too comfortable, too relaxed, too at home in your own body. Crossing your legs, even at the ankle, had to be done carefully, with constant awareness of where your skirt fell and what you might be revealing. Every moment spent sitting was a performance of sitting was propriety, a physical manifestation of self-control. Modern comparison, it's like trying to maintain perfect posture during a 3-hour Zoom meeting while also pretending you're not desperately uncomfortable, except the meeting lasts your entire life, and everyone is watching. And if you slouch even once, someone writes about it in their diary, and your reputation is ruined at the next bridge club gathering. The irony is that this obsession with posture was marketed as being about health and beauty, but it actually caused significant physical problems. Women developed chronic back pain, breathing difficulties, and digestive issues. But admitting you were in pain would mean admitting the system was flawed, and that was unthinkable. So women stood straight, walked gracefully, and quietly suffered, their spines serving as monuments to a society that valued appearance over actual human comfort. Shaking hands sounds straightforward, right? Wrong. In the 1920s, a woman's handshake was a minefield of potential disasters. Too firm and you were. Too limp and you were weak, possibly sickly. The correct handshake was a delicate balancing act. Extend your hand gracefully. Allow the man to take it gently. Offer the faintest pressure, like you were handing him a butterfly you didn't want to crush. And withdraw immediately. Never pump, never grip. And for heaven's sake, never initiate unless you were of significantly higher social standing. The handshake itself was relatively new territory for women. In previous decades, women didn't shake hands at all. They curtsied, nodded, or offered their hand to be kissed if the occasion was formal enough. But as the 20th century progressed and women began entering previously male-dominated spaces, offices, universities, professional settings, the handshake became unavoidable. The problem was that no one could agree on how a proper lady should do it. Etiquette authorities fell into camps. Some insisted women should offer a completely limp hand, a dead fish handshake, that signaled feminine delicacy and deference. The man would grasp it gently, barely applying pressure, perhaps give it the slightest upward motion and release. This handshake communicated that the woman was too refined, too delicate for the rough-and-tumble world of firm business grips. Others argued this made women look weak or disinterested and recommended a slightly firmer grip, but still nowhere near the strength a man would use. The duration mattered too. Hold the handshake too long, and you were being forward, possibly even seductive. Release too quickly, and you seemed cold or dismissive. The ideal was approximately 1.5 seconds, long enough to acknowledge the greeting, short enough to maintain propriety. Yes, women were expected to internally count during handshakes while also monitoring their grip strength, facial expression, and posture. Multitasking at its finest. Eye contact during the handshake was another variable. Too much and you were bold, possibly. Improper. Too little and you seemed shifty or rude. The correct approach was a brief glance, a small smile, then looking modestly away. You were acknowledging the person without challenging them, greeting them without claiming equality. Every element of the handshake was designed to reinforce social hierarchies and gender roles. And then there was the question of when to offer your hand at all. A woman never extended her hand first to a man unless she significantly outranked him socially. She waited for him to offer his hand, then decided whether to accept based on the context and her relationship to him. With other women, the higher status woman offered first. At formal events, married women outranked unmarried ones. Older women outranked younger ones. The social calculus required for a simple greeting was absurd. Modern comparison. Imagine every handshake feeling like a job interview where you're being evaluated on grip strength, duration, temperature, moisture level, and weather. You're conveying the exact right balance of confidence and submission. Now imagine doing this dozens of times a day while also worrying about whether your gloves are clean and if your hand is positioned at precisely the correct angle. It's like trying to execute a perfect golf swing while someone judges your moral character based on your follow-through. What's particularly frustrating is that men's handshakes were straightforward, firm, brief, confident, done. But women's handshakes had to navigate an impossible standard. Appear strong enough to be taken seriously, but weak enough to remain feminine. Engaged enough to be polite, but not so engaged as to seem forward. The handshake became yet another way women had to shrink themselves, quite literally pulling their punches to fit into a society that wanted them. Present but not powerful, visible but not threatening, acknowledged but never equal. Eating wasn't just about nourishment. In the 1920s, it was performance art. Women were expected to eat like elegant birds. Tiny bites, no visible chewing, absolutely no evidence that food was actually entering their bodies. Cutting your food required precision, small, delicate cuts, never sawing like you were butchering livestock. Sipping soup meant tilting the spoon away from you, bringing it to your lips, without slurping, and never, under any circumstances, blowing on it to cool it down. If you finished your plate too quickly, you were unrefined. Too slowly, you were difficult. The goal was to appear as though you barely needed sustenance at all. The rules for proper eating filled entire volumes. Emily Post's Etiquette guide dedicated chapters to table manners with separate sections for different types of foods. Bread had to be broken, never cut with a knife. You broke off small pieces, buttered them individually, and ate them one at a time, never buttering the entire slice like some kind of barbarian. Chicken required surgical precision. Certain parts could be eaten with fingers at informal dinners, but formal occasions demanded you carve every morsel with knife and fork, leaving behind anything that couldn't be elegantly separated from bone. Chewing was perhaps the most scrutinized aspect. Your mouth had to remain completely closed while chewing, your jaw movements minimal and discreet. The ideal was to chew so subtly that observers couldn't tell you were doing it at all. This meant taking incredibly small bites and chewing them thoroughly before swallowing, which turned every meal into an hour-long ordeal. Women were advised to put their forks down between bites, rest their hands in their laps, and never ever appear eager for the next mouthful. Drinking presented its own challenges. You sipped, never gulped. You dabbed your lips with your napkin before and after drinking to avoid leaving lipstick marks on the glass, though wearing obvious lipstick was itself questionable. Wine glasses were held by the stem, never the bowl, and you never drained your glass completely. Leaving a small amount suggested you had refined restraint rather than desperate thirst. Coffee and tea required similar precision, stirring quietly without clinking the spoon against the cup, removing the spoon and placing it on the saucer before drinking, and never blowing to cool the liquid. The nightmare scenario was dealing with food stuck in your teeth, or horror of horrors, needing to spit something out. The official guidance was to raise your napkin to your mouth and discreetly deposit the offending item while appearing to simply dab your lips. Coughing, choking, or any other sign that your body was actually processing food was mortifying. If you absolutely had to cough, you turned your head away, covered your mouth with your napkin, and murmured a quiet apology while dying of embarrassment. Portion sizes were another minefield. Women were expected to serve themselves small portions, demonstrating their delicate appetites and refined restraint. Taking. Large helpings suggested you were greedy or, worse, that you actually needed food to survive like some kind of peasant. Even if you were genuinely hungry, which you probably were, given that fashion demanded increasingly thin silhouettes, you took tiny portions and ate them slowly, pretending satisfaction. Modern comparison. It's like trying to eat spaghetti on a first date while your date's entire extended family watches and grades you on form, technique, and whether you're demonstrating appropriate femininity through your noodle consumption. Except the date lasts forever, the spaghetti never ends, and everyone has opinions about whether you're using enough or too much parmesan and what that says about your marriageability. The cruelty was that meals were social events where women were expected to be present, charming and conversational while also performing this elaborate food kabuki. You had to track multiple simultaneous variables: bite size, chewing discretion, conversation, contributions, posture, napkin placement, and whether you were accidentally monopolizing the salt cellar. Eating became so stressful that some women genuinely ate less in public, saving their actual meals for private moments where they could consume food like normal human beings. The message was clear. Even basic human needs had to be performed delicately, apologetically, as though your body's requirements were an embarrassing inconvenience to be minimized and hidden. Yes, we're talking about ankles. In the early 1920s, showing your ankle was still considered provocative, a remnant of Victorian prudishness that refused to die quietly. Hemlines were rising but slowly, and every inch revealed was met with moral panic from the older generation. Women had to master the art of sitting, walking, and exiting vehicles without flashing too much leg. Crossing your legs at the knee? Absolutely not. That was for flappers and fast women. The proper method was crossing at the ankle demurely with knees pressed together like you were holding a secret between them. The ankle obsession seems bizarre now, but it made perfect sense in a society that had spent the previous century treating women's legs as pornographic material that needed to be concealed at all costs. Victorian women wore floor-length skirts that completely hid their lower limbs. Catching a glimpse of ankle was genuinely titillating because it was so rare. Even as hemlines began creeping upward in the 1920s, that psychological association remained. Ankles were sexy, scandalous, inappropriate. Fashion was in open warfare with propriety during this period. Younger women, especially the emerging flapper culture, wanted shorter skirts for practical and rebellious reasons. Dancing the Charleston in a floor-length skirt was nearly impossible. Shorter hemlines allowed greater freedom of movement, which itself was radical. Women's clothing had historically been designed to restrict movement, to make them slow, careful, decorative. But conservative voices fought back hard, claiming that shorter skirts would lead to moral decay, promiscuity, and the general downfall of civilization. Churches got involved, with some ministers actually using rulers to measure women's hemlines at the door, refusing entry to anyone whose skirt didn't meet their standards. Schools implemented dress codes. Employers created workplace policies. The anxiety about exposed ankles reached fever pitch, with newspaper editorials predicting dire consequences and moral authorities issuing stern warnings about what visible legs would do to the social fabric. For individual women, this meant navigating an impossible situation. Fashion magazines promoted shorter skirts as modern and chic, but actually wearing them risked social condemnation, employment consequences, and being labeled as morally suspect. The compromise many women struck was context-dependent hemlines. Shorter skirts for dancing and informal gatherings with peers, longer skirts for church, work, and family events. They literally changed their morality with their outfits, because that's when you were most likely to accidentally reveal forbidden leg territory. The proper technique: approach the chair, turn, lower yourself gracefully while sweeping your skirt beneath you with one hand. Cross your ankles immediately and arrange the fabric to ensure complete coverage. Standing up required the reverse procedure, always maintaining coverage. A gust of wind could be catastrophic. Women developed elaborate strategies for outdoor walking, including the subtle art of pinning down your skirt with one hand while pretending you were simply resting it elegantly at your side. Modern comparison. Imagine if showing your elbows was considered sexually provocative. You'd have to wear long sleeves everywhere, and people would clutch their pearls if you rolled them up in summer. That's how absurd the ankle panic was. A.
Completely neutral body part suddenly charged with sexual meaning because society decided it should be hidden, and therefore revealing it must be intentional provocation. The really frustrating part was how this played into broader control of women's bodies and mobility. Keeping women in long, restrictive skirts literally slowed them down. You couldn't run in a floor-length skirt. You couldn't climb easily. You couldn't move through the world with the same freedom as men. Shorter hemlines represented more than fashion. They represented autonomy, practicality, and the radical idea that women's clothing should serve their needs rather than serving as portable symbols of modesty and sexual unavailability. The ankle wasn't just an ankle. It was a battleground in a larger war over women's freedom. And every visible inch was a small victory against a system designed to keep women covered, controlled, and confined. Gloves weren't just accessories. They were social armor with their own entire
rulebook. You wore gloves outdoors, always. Removing them indoors required specific timing and grace. You never ate while wearing gloves, unless you were at a formal tea, in which case you kept them on but only nibbled. Shaking hands, gloves stayed on. Greeting someone of higher social rank, gloves might come off depending on the setting. It was exhausting. And heaven forbid you lost a glove or showed up with a stain, your entire outfit, and by extension your character, was ruined. The glove rules were so complex they required genuine study. Different occasions demanded different glove lengths. Day gloves were typically wrist length, made of kid leather or fabric in neutral colors that coordinated with your outfit. Evening gloves were longer, sometimes reaching past the elbow, made of finer materials like silk or lace, often in white or coordinating colors. Opera gloves were the longest, creating the elegant arm silhouettes you see in vintage photographs where women look simultaneously glamorous and like they're prepping for surgery. Putting on gloves was itself a small performance. You didn't simply shove your hands in. You smoothed them on carefully, one finger at a time, ensuring no wrinkles or awkward bunching. The fit had to be perfect. Too tight, and you couldn't move your fingers properly. Too loose, and the gloves looked sloppy. Wealthy women had gloves custom fitted. Everyone else made do with ready-made options and hoped for the best. The removal process was equally choreographed. At a formal dinner, you removed your gloves after being seated, but before the first course. You pulled them off slowly, one finger at a time, then folded them neatly in your lap or placed them beside your plate. Yanking them off was vulgar. Leaving them crumpled was slovenly. Even your discarded gloves had to maintain composure. Different social situations required different glove decisions. Attending church? Gloves on. Visiting a friend's home? Remove them in. At a dance? Keep them on while dancing. Remove them for refreshments. Meeting the president? Special white kid gloves, pristine condition, removed only if he initiated a handshake and then replaced immediately after. The mental bandwidth required to track all these rules while also navigating the actual social event was enormous. Glove-related disasters could be socially devastating. Dropping a glove was embarrassing. You had to wait for someone to retrieve it for you rather than bending down yourself. That would look undignified. A stain or tear meant you either went home to change or spent the entire event mortified and self-conscious. Losing one glove of a matched pair was a minor tragedy because gloves were expensive and you couldn't just wear mismatched ones. Some women carried spare gloves to major events just in case. The symbolism went deeper than practical warmth or cleanliness. Gloves represented the barrier between proper women and the physical world. You didn't touch things directly with your bare hands. That was too intimate, too physical, too honest. Gloves mediated your interaction with everything. Doorknobs, handrails, other people's hands. They were a constant reminder that you needed to be insulated, protected, separated from direct experience. Modern comparison. Imagine if wearing the right style of face mask became not about health but about demonstrating your social status. And you needed different masks for different occasions. Mesh masks for parties, silk masks for dinner, longer masks for formal events, and you had to know exactly when to put them on and take them off based on complex social hierarchies. That's glove etiquette. Necessary, expensive, exhausting, and completely arbitrary. The economic burden was real. Quality gloves were expensive, and you needed multiple pairs. They wore out relatively quickly, especially if you wore them daily. Working-class women and middle-class women stretched their glove budgets as far as possible, mending tears and carefully cleaning stains. But wealthy women treated gloves as almost disposable, wearing a pair once or twice before discarding them. This created yet another visible class marker. The condition of your gloves announced your economic status as clearly as the size of your house. Everything, even hand coverings, became a signal in the elaborate code of 1920s social hierarchy. A woman's voice was supposed to be soft, melodious, and never ever loud. Raising your voice suggested you were common or lacked self-control. Laughing too loudly was vulgar. Speaking over a man was unthinkable.
The ideal tone was gentle, pleasant, and utterly devoid of strong opinions, unless those opinions matched your husband's or father's. Women were coached to modulate their voices, to speak in measured tones, to never dominate a conversation. In other words, to make themselves smaller even when they had something important to say. Voice training for young women was remarkably similar to voice training for stage performers, except instead of projecting, they were learning to minimize. Elocution lessons taught proper feminine speech, higher pitched than natural, breathy rather than resonant, soft enough to be described as musical but never powerful enough to command attention. The goal was a voice that decorated conversation rather than driving it, that complemented rather than competed. Certain words and phrases were considered unladylike. Direct contradictions were rude. Instead of no or I disagree, women were taught to say perhaps, or that's an interesting perspective, but I wonder if. Assertive language was masculine. Women were supposed to suggest, propose, wonder aloud, but never declare or demand. Even your vocabulary had to perform femininity, wrapping every opinion in layers of softening qualifiers until the actual point became nearly invisible. Laughter was particularly policed. A small tinkling laugh was acceptable, the kind that sounded like delicate bells or wind chimes, a hearty guffaw, a genuine belly laugh, the kind that makes your whole body shake. Absolutely not. That suggested you found something genuinely funny rather than just mildly amusing. And genuine emotion of any kind was suspicious. Women learned to stifle real laughter, to transform it into those restrained little chuckles that suggested pleasure without commitment to actual joy. Public speaking by women was still controversial in the 1920s, though gaining acceptance. Women who did speak publicly were scrutinized mercilessly, not primarily for the content of their words, but for their delivery. Were they too shrill, too aggressive, too masculine? Female suffragists and activists had to develop presentation styles that conveyed authority without triggering the reflexive dismissal that came with violating voice norms. It was an impossible balance. Be compelling enough to be heard, but gentle enough not to offend. The pitch police were real. Women who spoke in lower registers were sometimes advised to raise their pitch to sound more feminine.
Never mind that this was often uncomfortable and required conscious effort. Your natural voice was less important than your performed voice. Theatrical training, vocal coaching, even some finishing schools included exercises to help women speak in higher, breathier registers that signaled femininity and non-threatening compliance. Regional accents added another layer of complication. Certain accents were associated with lower classes or rural backgrounds. Women aspiring to move up socially often worked to eliminate regional speech patterns, adopting the neutral, refined accent associated with educated urban elites. This meant policing not just volume and pitch, but pronunciation, vocabulary, and cadence. Your voice became another marker of class mobility, another element of yourself that needed constant management and control. Modern comparison. Imagine if every time you spoke someone was silently grading you on how feminine or masculine you sounded, and your career prospects, marriage prospects, and social standing all depended on maintaining exactly the right vocal performance. It's like being a voice actor playing the role of acceptable woman 24 hours a day, never breaking character, never letting your actual voice emerge. The damage was psychological and physical. Women who spent years suppressing their natural speaking voices sometimes developed vocal strain, throat tension, and habitual speech patterns that felt uncomfortable but became ingrained. They lost connection with their authentic voices, literally and metaphorically. The message was clear. What you said mattered less than how you said it, and how you said it mattered less than ensuring you never said it too loudly, too forcefully, or too authentically. Even your sound waves had to be gentle, contained, non-threatening. Silence, ultimately, was the most feminine option of all. Here's the contradiction. Women were expected to look beautiful, but never to look like they tried. Makeup in the 1920s was a secret weapon that had to remain invisible. A little powder to mattify shine? Acceptable. Rouge applied so subtly it looked natural. Fine. But bright red lips, heavy kohl, or visible powder. That was the mark of a painted woman, code for prostitute or flapper, both equally scandalous in polite society. The goal was to enhance your natural beauty while pretending you woke up looking flawless, which required more effort than just wearing the makeup in the first place. The early 1920s existed in a transitional moment for cosmetics. Victorian attitudes still held considerable sway. Those generations had considered makeup morally suspect, something only actresses and prostitutes wore. Respectable women enhanced their appearance through skin care, pinching their cheeks for color and biting their lips for redness. But actual cosmetics were taboo. By the 1920s, this was changing, but slowly and with significant backlash. The cosmetics industry was exploding. Companies like Max Factor, Elizabeth Arden, and Helena Rubinstein were marketing makeup to middle-class women, linking it to modernity, sophistication, and feminine empowerment. But the product marketing was at odds with social acceptability. You could buy lipstick, but you couldn't obviously wear it without risking your reputation. The compromise was natural makeup, products designed to be undetectable. Face powder was the most acceptable cosmetic. Applied correctly, it simply mattified your skin, reducing shine without adding obvious color. But the application technique mattered enormously. Too much powder created a visible cake-alike texture, the dreaded powdered look that suggested you were trying too hard. The correct amount was barely perceptible, requiring expensive powder, proper tools, and skilled application. Women carried compact mirrors and powder puffs for touch-ups, but applying.
Powder in public was questionable. You excused yourself to the powder room, where you could attend to your appearance privately. Rouge blush was trickier. The goal was a subtle, natural-looking flush that suggested good health and modesty, not theatrical artifice. The product came in creams, powders, and papers, thin sheets you'd press against your cheeks. Application required artistry. Too much looked garish, too little was pointless. The placement mattered. Apples of the cheeks for youthful freshness, never too close to the nose or temples, and it had to blend seamlessly, leaving no obvious edges or streaks. Lipstick was the battleground. Dark, dramatic lips were associated with flappers, rebels, and women of questionable virtue. Conservative women either avoided lipstick entirely or used shades barely darker than their natural lip color. But fashion was pushing toward bolder lips. The classic 1920s Cupid's bow, defined and dramatic. The compromise many women struck was context-dependent. Natural lips for day and family events, bolder lips for evening and social occasions with peers. This meant carrying multiple shades and different settings. Eyebrow and eyelash enhancement existed, but was controversial. Penciling eyebrows was too obvious, too artificial. Some women used petroleum jelly or castor oil to darken lashes, creating subtle definition without looking made up. Eyeshadow existed but was primarily for evening wear and had to be applied with extraordinary subtlety, just enough to add depth, never enough to look colorful or deliberate. Modern comparison. It's like being told you need to look like you're wearing a full face of Instagram makeup while also making it appear you're wearing nothing at all. The no makeup look, except with 1920s products and techniques, requiring significant time and money to achieve an effect that's supposed to look effortless and natural. The math doesn't. The class dimension was significant. Expensive cosmetics were higher quality, more subtle, easier to apply invisibly. Cheap cosmetics were more obvious, wore off faster, often looked artificial. So wealthy women could achieve the approved naturally beautiful, risked looking painted even when trying for subtlety. As always, the rules were easier to follow if you had money. The underlying message was the same as ever. Women needed to be beautiful, but beauty had to appear effortless, natural, inherent rather than constructed. Admitting you worked at being attractive through makeup, through effort, through artifice, suggested you weren't naturally worthy, that you were cheating somehow. Your beauty had to be a gift from genetics, not a skill you developed or a product you'd purchased. It was one more impossible standard in an endless series of contradictions designed to keep women anxious, insecure, and focused on their appearance while simultaneously shaming them for caring too much about how they looked. Hats weren't optional. They were mandatory. A respectable woman never left the house without one. But choosing the right hat was an art form. Too extravagant and you were trying too hard. Too plain and you lacked refinement. The hat had to match your outfit, your social standing, and the occasion. It had to sit at the correct angle. Too far back suggested carelessness. Too far forward looked severe. And removing it indoors required timing. Too soon and you seemed eager to stay. Too late and you were overstaying your welcome. Your hat, in essence, was your social resume perched on your head. The 1920s was the golden age of millinery. Hat styles ranged from close-fitting cloches that hugged the skull to wide-brimmed picture hats that framed the face like artwork. Each style conveyed different messages about the wearer. Cloches suggested modernity, urban sophistication, and youth. Wider brims conveyed elegance and traditionalism. Feathered or heavily decorated hats demonstrated wealth and fashion consciousness. Simple, understated hats suggested practical sensibility, or depending on quality, economic constraint. Choosing a hat required considering multiple variables simultaneously. What was the occasion? Daytime shopping required a different hat than afternoon tea, which required a different hat than evening theater. What season was it? Straw hats for summer, felt for winter, velvet for formal occasions. What was your outfit's color palette? The hat had to coordinate without matching exactly. Matching was considered unsophisticated. What was your face shape? Different hat shapes flattered different facial structures, and choosing wrong could make you look ridiculous. The angle at which you wore your hat communicated volumes. A hat tilted jauntily to one side suggested playfulness, fashion-forwardness, maybe even flirtatiousness. A hat worn straight suggested seriousness. Propriety, conservatism. Too far forward and you looked severe or were hiding your face. Too far back and you looked careless, like you dressed in a hurry. The correct angle required experimentation and skill, often involving hat pins carefully positioned to hold the hat at exactly the right tilt. Hat pins themselves were a whole subculture. These long, often decorative pins pierced through the hat and your hair to hold everything in place. They could be beautiful, topped with jewels, pearls, or ornate designs, but they were also functional and sometimes dangerous. A hat pin was long enough to be used as a weapon, and some women reportedly used them for self-defense. But primarily they were tools of hat maintenance, requiring careful placement to avoid stabbing yourself while also achieving secure positioning. Indoor hat etiquette was maddeningly complex. At someone's home, you typically removed your hat in the entrance hall or parlor. At a restaurant, the rules varied by formality. Time of day. At church, women kept hats on, unlike men who removed theirs. At the theater, large hats were supposed to be removed so as not to block views, but smaller hats could remain. The timing of removal communicated your intentions. Removing your hat immediately suggested you planned to stay. Keeping it on suggested a brief visit. Caring for hats was labor-intensive. They couldn't be crushed or carelessly stored. Hat boxes were essential for transport and storage. Brims needed to be protected from moisture and crushing. Decorations, feathers, flowers, ribbons required maintenance and occasional replacement. For women with multiple hats, and fashionable women needed several, this meant significant storage space and upkeep time. Modern comparison. Imagine if you had to wear a small, carefully chosen billboard on your head every time you left home, and everyone judged your taste, social status, and moral character based on your billboard choices.
Too flashy?
Wrong angle. You're incompetent. That's hat culture. Personal expression filtered through rigid social expectations where even your headwear was scrutinized for hidden meanings. The economic burden was real. Hats were expensive, especially fashionable ones. Working-class women often had one or two serviceable hats that they wore repeatedly. Middle-class women balanced fashion and budget, perhaps having a few hats for different occasions. Wealthy women treated hats like seasonal accessories, acquiring new ones frequently to stay current with changing styles. This created another visible class marker. The style, quality, and quantity of your hats announced your economic status as clearly as your address. Your head became another site of class performance, another element of yourself that needed to be managed, curated, and presented correctly to maintain your position in the elaborate social hierarchy of 1920s America. Believe it or not, crossing the street had rules. A proper lady never rushed to cross even if traffic was coming. That would suggest panic or a lack of composure. Instead, she waited gracefully for a man to offer his arm, then crossed at a measured pace, as though she had all the time in the world. If no man was available, she moved with deliberate elegance, skirts held just high enough to avoid puddles, but never so high as to reveal anything improper. Jaywalking? Unthinkable. That was for ruffians and suffragettes, both equally terrifying to conservative society. Street crossing in the 1920s was genuinely more dangerous than today. Traffic signals were still relatively new. Many intersections lacked them entirely. Cars, horses, streetcars, bicycles, and pedestrians all competed for space with minimal regulation. Women's long skirts and restrictive clothing made moving quickly difficult and potentially hazardous. Tripping on your hem while dodging a car could be fatal, so some of the caution was practical, but as with everything else, practical concerns became wrapped in layers of gendered expectations and social performance. The ideal street crossing involved waiting at the curb with perfect posture while surveying traffic conditions. If a gentleman was present, husband, brother, father, or even a helpful stranger, he offered his arm. The woman placed her hand lightly on his forearm, and they crossed together at a measured walk. He navigated. She trusted his judgment and matched his pace. This ritual reinforced gendered ideas about protection, dependence, and male authority over navigation of public space. If no male escort was available, a woman had several options, none ideal. She could wait until the traffic cleared completely, avoiding the need to time her crossing or move quickly. She could coordinate with other women, crossing in a group that provided mutual support and safety. Or she could cross alone, which required projecting confidence while maintaining feminine composure, walking purposefully but not hurriedly, appearing calm but alert, managing her skirts while also watching for vehicles.
The skirt management was its own challenge. Long skirts would drag in mud, puddles, and whatever else covered early 20th century streets, which was often horse manure, garbage, and general filth. To keep skirts clean, women would gather the fabric slightly, lifting it just enough to clear the ground. But lifting too high revealed ankles or, horror of horrors, calves. The correct lift was minimal, subtle, accomplished with one hand while the other maintained balance or held a handbag. In wet weather, this became nearly impossible. You needed one hand for an umbrella, one for skirts, and somehow you also needed to navigate traffic and maintain your balance. The pace itself was gendered. Men strode across streets with purpose and speed. Women glided. Rushing suggested undignified panic. Running was absolutely forbidden except in life-threatening emergencies, and even then you'd be judged. Proper crossing was unhurried, dignified, serene. Even if a streetcar was bearing down on you, you maintained composure. Better to be hit by a vehicle while looking dignified than to survive while appearing frantic. Street corners became social stages. Other pedestrians watched and judged. Crossing poorly could become neighborhood gossip. Did you see Mrs. Henderson practically running across Fifth Avenue like some kind of shopgirl late for work? Where did she learn her manners? The surveillance was constant, the judgment swift, and your reputation was always at stake, even in something as mundane as crossing a street. Modern comparison. Imagine if crossing the street required choreography, costume management, and the potential presence of a male chaperone, and people judged your entire character based on whether you jaywalked or waited for the light. Some of that still happens, but add restrictive clothing, genuine danger from unregulated traffic, and the expectation that you'll maintain ballroom posture while dodging horse-drawn carriages, and you've got 1920 street crossing. The broader message was about women's relationship to public space. Streets, sidewalks, commercial districts. These were still coded as primarily male territory. Women could access them, but only while performing appropriate femininity and ideally under male protection or supervision. Independent navigation of public space was suspect. A woman alone on the street, moving with confidence and purpose, suggested she might be working, possibly in an unsuitable profession, or that she lacked proper family oversight. Even something as basic as getting from one side of the street to the other became an opportunity to reinforce gender hierarchies and social control. Your body, your movement, your very presence in public space had to be managed, justified, and performed correctly, or risk the endless judgment of a society determined to police every aspect of women's existence. In the 1920s, failing to send a thank you note wasn't just rude, it was social suicide. Every dinner invitation, every gift, every polite gesture required a handwritten note delivered within 24 to 48 hours. The note had to be perfectly formatted. Proper salutation, gracious acknowledgement, specific mention of the event or gift, and a warm closing. Too effusive and you seemed desperate for approval. Too brief and you were cold. The stationery mattered too, plain but quality, never garish. Women spent hours each week writing these notes, maintaining a delicate web of social obligations that never, ever ended. The thank you note system was an entire industry. Stationers sold pre-printed cards for various occasions, but truly refined women used personalized stationery with their name or monogram engraved at the top. The paper quality signaled your class position. Thick, creamy stock with subtle watermarks for the wealthy. Thinner paper for everyone else. The color was almost always white or cream. Anything else was considered too informal or attention-seeking. Even your choice of ink mattered. Black for formal occasions, dark blue acceptable for less formal correspondence. The content followed strict formulas. You opened with, "Dear Mrs. Patterson," or whatever the appropriate form of address was. Getting this wrong was a significant faux pas. The first sentence expressed gratitude. "Thank you so much for the lovely dinner party last evening." The middle section had to be specific enough to prove you actually attended and paid attention. The roasted duck was exquisite, and I so enjoyed our conversation about the new library renovations. Generic praise suggested you didn't care enough to remember details. The closing was warm but not too familiar, with warmest regards or most sincerely yours followed by your signature. The timing was crucial and unforgiving. For dinner parties, the note needed to arrive within 2 days maximum. For overnight visits, you wrote the note the morning after you returned home and mailed it immediately. For gifts, you had a week at most, though sooner was better. Failing to send a note within the prescribed time frame was noticed, discussed, and remembered. Your name would come up at the next gathering. "I hosted Eleanor 3 weeks ago and still haven't received a note. Can you imagine? I thought she was better than that." The labor involved was substantial. A socially active woman might write a dozen thank you notes weekly.
Each one required time to compose thoughtfully, careful handwriting. Mistakes meant starting over on fresh stationery, proper addressing of the envelope, appropriate postage, and timely mailing. For women managing households, raising children, and maintaining busy social calendars, this was hours of unpaid emotional labor weekly, all to maintain social standing and avoid giving offense. The notes created an endless chain of obligation. You went to a dinner party, sent a thank you note. The host received your note and felt obligated to invite you to the next event. You attended, sent another note. The cycle never broke. Failing to send notes meant invitations stopped coming. You were quietly dropped from guest lists, excluded from social circles, your reputation damaged by your supposed ingratitude or poor breeding. Modern comparison. Imagine if every social interaction required formal written follow-up, assessed for tone, timing, and penmanship, and your entire social life depended on maintaining perfect correspondence. It's like if every text message had to be a carefully composed email delivered by physical mail arriving within 48 hours, or you'd be socially cancelled by your entire community. But here's the deeper issue. The thank you note system was another mechanism of control and surveillance. It kept women busy with domestic and social obligations, consuming time and mental energy that could have been directed toward education, careers, or political activism. It reinforced class hierarchies. Those who could afford nice stationery and had time to write leisurely notes demonstrated their superiority over those who couldn't. And it created a paper trail of social connections, debts, and obligations that bound women into restrictive networks of mutual monitoring. The expectation was gendered, too. While men sent thank you notes for formal occasions, women were expected to note everything, every kindness, every gift, every social nicety. Their gratitude had to be performed, documented, and delivered properly. Verbal thanks at the time of the event weren't sufficient. Written confirmation was mandatory. It was as though women's words needed to be made permanent, recorded, proven. Your appreciation, like your smile and your posture and your voice, had to be managed, formatted, and presented correctly, or you failed at being a proper woman. Even gratitude became another performance, another test you could fail. Sitting down sounds simple. It wasn't. A lady never plopped into a chair. She lowered herself gracefully, knees together, back straight, hands folded in her lap. Once seated, she couldn't sprawl, lean back, or get too comfortable. Crossing legs at the knee was scandalous. Crossing at the ankle was acceptable but required constant vigilance to keep your skirt from riding up. If you sat too long in one position, you risked looking stiff. If you shifted too much, you seemed restless or ill-bred. Every moment spent sitting was a performance, and the audience was always watching. The approach to the chair itself required choreography. You didn't simply walk up and sit. You approached with measured steps, turned so your back was to the chair, smoothly swept one hand behind you to gather your skirt, and lowered yourself in a single fluid motion, knees together, back straight, weight distributed evenly. Landing off-center or with an audible thump was mortifying. The entire movement was supposed to look effortless, like you were a feather settling onto a cushion rather than a human being subject to gravity. Once seated, your posture became a full-time job. You perched on the front two-thirds of the chair, never using the backrest unless you were elderly or infirm. Leaning back suggested you were too relaxed, too comfortable, too at home in your own body. Your spine remained straight, your shoulders back, your chin level. Your hands rested in your lap, fingers loosely interlaced, or one hand gently placed over the other. Gripping the armrest suggested tension. Letting your hands dangle looked sloppy. The leg position was an ongoing battle. Knees pressed together always. Ankles could be crossed. Left over right was traditional, though right over left was acceptable in some circles. But the crossing had to be subtle, close to the floor, and your skirt had to remain positioned to cover everything. From mid-calf down, if your skirt rode up even slightly, you discreetly adjusted it with one hand while pretending to smooth a non-existent wrinkle. The adjustment couldn't be obvious or fussy. That drew attention to the problem. It had to be so subtle that observers weren't sure if you'd moved at all. Shifting positions was permitted but had to be done rarely and gracefully. You couldn't fidget, squirm, or constantly readjust. If your foot fell asleep or your back cramped, you suffered quietly until an appropriate moment to stand or subtly shift weight. The acceptable frequency was perhaps once every 15 to 20 minutes maximum. More than that and you appeared nervous, uncomfortable, or poorly trained. Less than that and you risked genuine physical discomfort. But discomfort was preferable to appearing restless. Your feet presented another challenge. They needed to be positioned attractively, not splayed, not pigeon-toed, not tucked awkwardly under the chair. The ideal was slight angle, toes pointed slightly outward in what was considered a graceful position. If you were wearing heeled shoes, the positioning was easier. Flat shoes required more conscious positioning to avoid looking clumsy. And you never ever bounced your foot, tapped your toes, or drummed your heel. Any repetitive movement suggested impatience or poor breeding. The duration of sitting added complexity. At a formal dinner, you might be seated for hours, maintaining this posture through multiple courses, conversation, and post-dinner coffee. At a tea party, you'd sit for an hour or more. At home receiving visitors, you'd remain seated and composed throughout their entire visit, which could extend indefinitely. The physical endurance required was significant, especially given that corsets and restrictive undergarments already limited your breathing and movement. Modern comparison. Imagine every time you sit down you're being filmed for a posture training video, and your performance will be reviewed and graded by everyone present. Now imagine maintaining that level of consciousness about your sitting position for hours at a time, multiple times daily, forever. It's like being a ballet dancer who's always on stage, except the stage is every chair in your life. The class implications were stark. Wealthy women who'd attended finishing schools had years of training in proper sitting technique. They'd practiced with books balanced on their heads, rods strapped to their backs, and instructors who corrected every slouch and shift. Working-class women who spent their days doing physical labor and didn't have access to such training sat differently, more functionally, less performatively. This made sitting position another visible class marker. You could identify someone's background by how they occupied a chair. The health consequences were real. Maintaining rigid posture for extended periods caused back pain, hip tension, and circulation problems. The combination of tight corsets, restricted breathing, and static positioning could lead to fainting, which ironically was considered a feminine trait rather than a consequence of idiotic clothing and posture requirements. Women developed chronic pain conditions that were dismissed as female complaints, when they were actually the result of spending hours daily in physically stressful positions that served no purpose except social performance. But admitting that sitting properly hurt would mean admitting the system was flawed, and that was unthinkable. So women sat beautifully, painfully, endlessly, their bodies bent to the demands of a society that valued appearance over health, performance over comfort, and conformity over the basic human need to occasionally just slouch. The parasol wasn't just for shade. It was a symbol of gentility and a prop in the theater of femininity. Carrying one suggested you were refined enough to protect your skin from the sun because tan skin was associated with outdoor labor. And lower classes, but using the parasol required finesse. The angle had to be just right, the grip delicate, the movements fluid. Twirling it suggested frivolity, holding it too rigidly looked awkward, and if you forgot it at home, you might as well have forgotten your dignity. The parasol's primary function was protecting skin from sun exposure, and this was about class, not health. Pale skin signified that you didn't work outdoors, that you had the leisure and means to avoid manual labor. A suntan marked you as a field worker, a farmer, someone who couldn't afford to stay inside during working hours. For women aspiring to or maintaining higher social status, pale skin was essential. The parasol was your mobile shade, your portable proof that you took your class position seriously. But parasols weren't simple sun blockers. They were fashion accessories with their own style requirements. The parasol had to coordinate with your outfit without matching exactly. The color, material, and trim all mattered. Silk parasols with lace edges for formal occasions, cotton or linen for daytime casual use. The handle could be simple wood, carved ivory, or ornately decorated metal, depending on the formality and your budget. Some women owned multiple parasols for different outfits and occasions, creating yet another category of mandatory accessories. Carrying the parasol required practiced grace. You held it at a specific angle, tilted back just enough to shade your face and shoulders, but not so far back that you blocked the view of people behind you. The grip was delicate, fingers wrapped around the handle, but not clutching desperately. Your arm position mattered too. Held too high and you looked like you were signaling for help. Too low and the shade was ineffective. The sweet spot was approximately shoulder height, angled at about 45 degrees. Opening and closing the parasol was a small performance. You didn't snap it open aggressively like you were preparing for combat. You opened it smoothly with a gentle upward motion, allowing it to unfurl elegantly. Closing it required reversing the process smoothly, quietly, without fumbling with the mechanism or letting it collapse suddenly. The folding and securing had to be accomplished gracefully, one-handed if possible, without obviously struggling with the clasp. Movement with an open parasol required spatial awareness. You couldn't just walk normally. You had to account for the parasol's width and height. In crowds, you adjusted the angle to avoid poking people. Going through doorways meant lowering or angling it. Wind presented challenges. A sudden gust could turn your parasol inside out, which was both embarrassing and potentially damaging to an expensive accessory. Some women practiced parasol handling in different weather conditions to avoid public mishaps. The parasol also served as a prop for social interaction. You could use it to partially shield your face during conversations you wanted to. Keep private. You could adjust it while thinking, buying time before responding to a question. You could gesture subtly with it to indicate direction or draw attention. In the hands of a skilled user, the parasol became an extension of social performance, a tool for managing attention and creating small moments of mystery or emphasis. Modern comparison. Imagine if carrying an umbrella became a mandatory fashion statement even on sunny days, and people judged your social class and refinement based on your umbrella handling technique. That's parasol culture. A practical item transformed into a mandatory performance prop where even your sun protection had to be executed with grace and style. The economic dimension was significant. Quality parasols were expensive. The frame needed to be sturdy but lightweight. The fabric had to be thick enough to provide real shade but fine enough to look elegant. The construction required skilled labor. Wealthy women treated parasols as somewhat. A parasol from last season was already out of fashion. Middle-class women made parasols last, carefully maintaining them and occasionally updating the fabric cover to extend their usefulness. Working-class women often couldn't afford parasols at all, making their suntanned skin both a marker of poverty and a barrier to social advancement. The parasol also reinforced women's fragility. You needed protection from the sun, not because sun exposure is genuinely dangerous in moderation, but because your delicate feminine skin couldn't withstand it. You were too refined, too delicate, too special to endure normal weather conditions. This narrative of fragility served multiple purposes. It justified restrictions on women's activities. You can't go hiking, you'll get sun damage. It created dependence. You need special equipment for basic outdoor activity. And it reinforced class hierarchies. Wealthy women could afford protection. Poor women couldn't. The parasol culture began declining in the late 1920s and 1930s as suntans actually became fashionable, a shift driven by Coco Chanel and changing attitudes about health and leisure. But in its heyday, the parasol was another mandatory element in the elaborate costume of acceptable femininity, another object that had to be purchased, maintained, and wielded correctly. Another performance requirement in a life already oversaturated with them. Even protection from the sun became a test of your refinement. Another way to succeed or fail at being a proper lady. What you talked about mattered as much as how you said it. Women were discouraged from discussing politics, religion, money, or anything unpleasant. Safe topics included the weather, fashion, children if you had them, and vague compliments about your surroundings. But even these had rules. Don't complain about the weather. Don't brag about your children. Don't dominate the conversation. The goal was to be pleasant, agreeable, and forgettable. A conversational decoration rather than a participant. Heaven forbid you had an original thought or, worse, expressed it. The list of forbidden topics for polite female conversation was extensive and revealing. Politics topped the list. Women could have political opinions, but expressing them in mixed company was considered inappropriate and unfeminine. Religion was similarly taboo unless the discussion was safely generic. Wasn't the sermon lovely? Money was absolutely forbidden. Discussing finances, prices, salaries, or economic concerns was vulgar. Health complaints beyond the vaguest references were inappropriate. Anything controversial, anything that might spark genuine debate or disagreement, was off limits. This left women with an extremely narrow range of acceptable conversation. The weather was always safe, but you had to approach it correctly. Pleasant observations only, never complaints. Fashion was acceptable and actually encouraged, as it reinforced feminine interests and kept conversation superficial. Children could be mentioned if you had them, but you couldn't monopolize the conversation with proud parenting stories or, worse, complain about the difficulties of child-rearing. Compliments about the hostess's home, the food, or someone's outfit were encouraged, but they had to sound sincere and not too effusive. The tone mattered as much as the topic. Women were expected to be agreeable, supportive conversationalists who drew others out rather than dominating discussion. The ideal contribution was a thoughtful question that allowed someone else to speak, a gentle observation that moved conversation forward without claiming too much attention, or a warm affirmation of what someone else had said. Disagreement had to be wrapped in so many qualifiers and softening phrases that the actual disagreement became nearly invisible. Storytelling had strict limits. Anecdotes had to be brief, relevant, and self-deprecating rather than self-aggrandizing. A story that made you look clever or accomplished risked seeming boastful. Stories that went on too long suggested you couldn't read social cues. The safest stories were mildly humorous, gently self-mocking, and designed to make others comfortable rather than to showcase your wit or experiences. Intellectual topics were particularly fraught. If you'd read something interesting, you couldn't discuss it too enthusiastically or in too much depth. That suggested you were a blue-stocking, an intellectual, a woman who prioritized mental pursuits over feminine duties. If you had expertise in something, you downplayed it. God forbid you corrected a man's factual error, even gently. That was social suicide. Better to stay quiet and let him be wrong than to embarrass him with your knowledge. The goal of female conversation, according to etiquette experts, was to be pleasant and to facilitate others' conversation rather than to contribute substantially yourself. You were supposed to ask questions, murmur. Encouragement, laugh at jokes, and generally serve as an appreciative audience for others, particularly men. Your conversational role was supporting actor, never lead. You helped others shine. You didn't shine yourself. Modern comparison. Imagine every conversation being a job interview where you're assessed on agreeability and pleasantness rather than substance. And having interesting opinions or knowledge actively works against you. It's like being required to dumb yourself down in real time while also appearing engaged and interested, forever playing a character who's fascinated by others but has no depth of her own. The enforcement was constant and subtle. If you expressed a strong opinion, conversation shifted uncomfortably. People exchanged glances. The next day, someone might gently mention that you seemed quite passionate about something, a polite warning that you'd overstepped. If you did it repeatedly, invitations slowed. You developed a reputation as difficult or too much, or not very feminine. The social consequences of authentic conversation were real and lasting. This conversational straitjacket had psychological effects. Women learned to suppress their thoughts, to question whether their observations were worth sharing, to defer to others, even when they had superior knowledge. They internalized the message that their ideas mattered less, that their primary value in social situations was decorative and supportive rather than substantive. Some women developed rich interior lives that had no outlet, thoughts, opinions, and observations that circled endlessly in their minds because there was no socially acceptable way to express them. The cruelty was that women were also judged for being boring. If you followed all the rules, stuck to safe topics, never expressed strong opinions, stayed agreeable and pleasant, you risked being dismissed as uninteresting, vapid, or dull. But stepping outside the rules was even worse. You couldn't win. Was designed to be unwinnable, keeping women anxious, self-monitoring, and focused on managing their social performance rather than developing and expressing their authentic selves. The curtsy wasn't dead in the 1920s, it was just evolving. While deep curtsies were reserved for royalty or formal occasions, a small dip of the knees was still expected when greeting elders or social superiors. But the curtsy had to be perfect, not too deep. You're not groveling, not too shallow, you're not disrespectful, and executed smoothly without wobbling. It was a physical acknowledgement of your place in the social hierarchy, a reminder that even your body language had to defer to those above you. The mechanics of a proper curtsy were more complex than they appeared. You didn't simply bend your knees. The correct technique involved placing one foot slightly behind the other, bending both knees while keeping your back straight, lowering yourself in a controlled descent, holding the position for a beat, then rising smoothly. Your head could incline slightly but shouldn't bob. Your hands, if you were wearing a skirt with fullness, might grasp the fabric lightly on either side, spreading it slightly as you descended, a gesture that added grace and feminine flair. The depth of the curtsy communicated your assessment of the social hierarchy. Meeting royalty or someone of significantly higher rank required a deeper curtsy, knees bent more, descent lower, duration slightly longer. Meeting someone only marginally superior required a subtle dip, barely noticeable, just enough to acknowledge the difference without making a production of it. Misjudging the appropriate depth was embarrassing. Too deep and you were mocked for excessive deference. Too shallow and you were rude. Young girls practiced curtsying from early childhood. It was part of deportment training, rehearsed until it became automatic. Girls curtsied to their parents, to teachers, to visiting adults. The curtsy was embedded. So deeply that it became reflexive. You didn't think about whether to curtsy. You just did it when encountering someone who outranked you. This physical habit reinforced social hierarchies, literally embedding them into your muscle memory. The curtsy also had gendered implications. Men bowed, a gesture that involved bending at the waist, a movement that could appear dignified, respectful, even powerful. Women curtsied, a movement that required lowering your entire body, making yourself smaller and lower. The physical difference in greeting gestures reinforced gender hierarchies. Men acknowledged each other as equals or near equals. Women physically lowered themselves before others. In the 1920s, the curtsy was beginning to fade in casual contexts, especially among younger, more progressive women. Flappers often skipped it entirely, instead offering handshakes or casual nods. This was seen as radical, a rejection of traditional deference structures. Conservative voices lamented the death of the curtsy as evidence of declining standards and disrespect for authority. The generational battle over whether to curtsy became a proxy for larger conflicts about women's changing roles. But in formal contexts, the curtsy persisted. Meeting anyone of genuine importance, a governor, a bishop, a society matron of legendary status, still required the curtsy. School events, formal presentations, and traditional social occasions all maintained curtsy requirements. Young women navigated a confusing landscape where some situations demanded curtsying and others didn't, and choosing wrong in either direction risked social consequences. Modern comparison. Imagine if you had to physically lower yourself every time you met someone more important than you, and the exact amount you lowered yourself had to precisely match the status differential, and everyone was watching to see if you got it right. It's like a physical pop quiz on social hierarchy administered constantly throughout your daily life. The curtsy also intersected with other etiquette requirements.
If you were carrying packages, you had to manage them while curtsying. If you were wearing a particularly long skirt, you had to gather it appropriately.
If you were in a crowded space, you needed enough room to curtsy without bumping into others. The physical logistics could be challenging, but they had to appear effortless. The psychological impact was significant. Every curtsy was a physical reminder of your subordinate status. You literally made yourself smaller, lower, less elevated than the person you were greeting. This reinforced inferiority not just intellectually but physically, embedding the hierarchy into your bones and joints. Young girls who curtsied hundreds of times during childhood learned at a bodily level that they ranked below others, that their natural height and position needed to be reduced in the presence of superiors. The resistance to curtsying when it came was about more than just saving your knees. It was about refusing to physically enact subordination. When women stopped curtsying, they were claiming equal standing, refusing to lower themselves, literally or figuratively. The simple act of remaining upright, of greeting others from your full height, became a small but significant rebellion against a system designed to keep women down, literally down, on bent knees, acknowledging their lesser status with their entire bodies. Perfume was another contradiction. You were supposed to smell pleasant, but never overtly perfumed. Too much fragrance suggested you were fast or trying to mask something, poor hygiene perhaps, or worse. The ideal scent was light, floral, barely detectable unless someone was very close to you. Choosing the wrong perfume could brand you as tasteless or, God forbid, European in the scandalous way, and applying it visibly in public. Absolutely not. Perfume was meant to be a whisper, not a shout. The perfume industry was booming in the 1920s with new scents and marketing strategies targeting middle-class women. French perfumes, Chanel No. 5, released in 1921, was revolutionary, represented sophistication and luxury. But American perfumes were becoming more accessible, available at department stores and through mail-order catalogs. The range of choices created new opportunities for getting it wrong. Choosing a perfume requires understanding subtle social codes. Floral scents, rose, violet, lily of the valley, were safe and traditionally feminine. Heavier, muskier scents were associated with sexuality and were therefore questionable. Oriental perfumes with exotic ingredients were fascinating but risky, too foreign, too sensual, too much. The safest choice was a light floral that smelled clean, fresh, and innocent. Anything too distinctive, too memorable, too powerful suggested you were trying to seduce someone or cover up something unsavory. The application technique was crucial. You never sprayed perfume in public. That was a vulgar display. Application happened at home, privately, before you left. The recommended method was minimal. A single dab behind each ear, perhaps at the pulse points on your wrists, possibly at the base of your throat. The goal was a scent that emerged subtly when someone was close to you, not a fragrance cloud that announced your presence from across the room. The amount was the constant challenge. Too little, and why bother? The one everyone talked about, the one who bathed in perfume, a phrase that was never a compliment. Perfume had to be applied with precision, literally drops, not splashes. Many perfumes came in bottles with dabbers or stoppers rather than sprays, forcing careful, minimal application. The class dimensions were significant. Expensive perfumes were generally more subtle and refined. Cheap perfumes tended to be heavier, sweeter, more obvious. So wearing the wrong perfume didn't just suggest poor taste, it advertised your economic status. Wealthy women could afford French perfumes that whispered quality. Working-class women wearing drugstore scents were immediately identifiable by their fragrance or lack thereof. Some women wore no perfume at all, either from religious conviction, particularly among conservative Protestants who saw perfume as vanity or economic necessity. The gendered aspect was stark. Men wore cologne, bay rum, witch hazel, or light citrus scents that were considered bracing and masculine. Their fragrances could be noticeable without consequence. Women's perfumes had to be discreet, subtle, almost imperceptible. This fit into larger patterns about women's presence. You could be decorative, but you couldn't dominate space. Your scent, like your voice and your opinions, had to be contained, controlled, barely there.
Modern comparison.
Imagine if wearing any noticeable amount of perfume got you labeled as trashy or desperate, but you were also expected to smell better than you.
Natural scent and achieving that impossible balance required expensive products and perfect application technique.
It's like being told to be beautiful but invisible, present but unobtrusive, enhanced but natural. The moral panic about perfume connected to broader anxieties about women and sexuality. Perfume was associated with seduction, with deliberate attempts to attract male attention. A woman who wore noticeable perfume was advertising her availability, her sexual awareness. Proper women smelled clean and fresh with perhaps the faintest floral hint. Improper women announced themselves with heavy, musky, intoxicating scents. This created impossible double binds. Smelling too much like perfume was scandalous, but body odor was also unacceptable. Women needed to smell clean, which required bathing, deodorant, a relatively new product, and possibly light fragrance. Managing your scent became another element of constant self-monitoring. Were you too fragrant? Not fragrant enough? Was your perfume too heavy for daytime, too light for evening? Did it clash with your soap or powder? The perfume bottle itself was often displayed on dressing tables, beautiful glass containers that signaled taste and wealth. But the product inside had to be used so sparingly as to be almost invisible. It was conspicuous consumption that resulted in invisible consumption. Another way women's money went toward products that were supposed to enhance them without anyone noticing the enhancement. Your perfume bottle announced your sophistication. Your actual scent had to suggest you were naturally blessed with pleasant fragrance, not that you'd purchased and applied it. Even your smell had to be effortless, natural, inherent, rather than achieved. Because admitting you worked at anything, including smelling good, undermined the illusion of effortless feminine perfection that the entire system demanded. The telephone was relatively new, and so were its etiquette rules. Women were expected to answer promptly but not too eagerly, to speak clearly but softly, and to keep conversations brief unless the other party was of higher social standing. Giggling on the phone was inappropriate. Discussing anything important was discouraged. That's what letters were for. And if a man called, you were supposed to sound pleased but not desperate, interested but not forward. Every phone call was a tightrope walk between propriety and connection. Telephones were still somewhat novel in middle-class homes during the 1920s. They represented modernity and progress, but they also created new social anxieties. Suddenly, you could be reached at any time by anyone. The telephone ring was an intrusion into domestic space, an unpredictable interruption that required immediate response. And unlike letters, which could be carefully composed, telephone conversations happened in real time with no opportunity for revision or careful thought. Answering the telephone had its own protocol. You picked up. After 2 or 3 rings, promptly enough to show you were attentive, but not so quickly that you seemed to have been lurking by the phone, waiting desperately for calls. The greeting was formal. Mrs. Patterson's residence or the Patterson home, identifying the household rather than yourself. Only in very informal contexts would you answer with hello, and even then your tone had to be pleasant but not overly warm until you knew who was calling. The voice quality mattered enormously. Early telephone technology didn't transmit sound with perfect clarity, so speaking too softly meant being misunderstood. Speaking too loudly suggested you were common or didn't understand how to use the device properly. The ideal was clear, measured speech at moderate volume. You articulated carefully, spoke in complete sentences, and avoided slang or casual language. The telephone might be modern, but your language remained formal. Call duration was strictly monitored. Telephone service was expensive. and in many areas you shared party lines with other households who might need access. Long conversations were considered selfish and wasteful. Business calls should be brief and to the point. Social calls could be slightly longer, but even then you kept an eye on the clock. 15 to 20 minutes was generous. Longer than that and you risked being considered thoughtless or gossipy. Content restrictions were similar to in-person conversation, but even more stringent. The telephone wasn't secure.
Operators might be listening, and on party lines, neighbors definitely were. You never discussed anything truly private, confidential, or controversial over the phone. Financial matters, family problems, health issues, and anything potentially embarrassing were saved for in-person conversations or letters. The telephone was for brief social pleasantries, arranging meetings, or urgent practical matters only. For young women, receiving calls from men was particularly loaded. A man
calling you meant he was interested, and your response mattered enormously.
You needed to sound pleased but not too pleased, available but not too available. Your voice had to communicate warmth without desperation, interest without commitment, and your family was likely listening.
So you had to manage not just the conversation but also the impression you were making on eavesdropping parents and siblings. Modern comparison. Imagine if every phone call was a formal interaction where you were being judged on tone, duration, content, and how well you balanced warmth with propriety. And also, your neighbors might be listening, and the technology was expensive enough that you were constantly aware of cost. It's like every call being a customer service interaction where you're both the customer and the service provider, trying to sound perfect while saying as little as possible. The telephone also created new forms of social obligation. If someone called you, you were expected to return the
call within a reasonable time frame, generally within a day or two.
Failing to return calls was rude and could damage relationships, but calling too frequently was also problematic. It suggested you had nothing better to do or that you were overly attached. Women had to track call frequency, ensuring they weren't pestering anyone but also weren't appearing aloof. The technology itself was sometimes intimidating. Not everyone understood how to use telephones properly. You had to speak into the mouthpiece at the correct distance, hold the earpiece properly, and operate the hook or cradle to end calls correctly. Fumbling with the technology made you seem old-fashioned or incompetent.
There were stories, possibly apocryphal, of people shouting into telephones because they thought louder was better, or people who didn't understand they needed to hang up to end the call. The telephone represented a shift in how women connected with the world outside their homes. It offered new possibilities
for communication, coordination, and social networking. But as with every new technology, it was immediately subjected to social rules designed to maintain existing hierarchies and gender norms. The telephone could have been liberating, instant communication, connection across distance. Instead, it became another arena for policing women's behavior, another tool that came with restrictions, obligations, and endless opportunities to fail at performing femininity correctly. The 1920s saw the rise of jazz and new dances like the Charleston, which scandalized the older generation. But even in this era of loosening morals, rules remained. You never asked a man to dance. You waited to be asked. You never danced too close. That was for married couples only. You never danced too wildly. You'd be labeled a flapper.
The goal was to look graceful, controlled, and just flirtatious enough to be interesting, but not so much that you'd be talked about the next day.
Dancing was freedom, but only within very specific boundaries. The dance floor was a battleground between tradition and modernity. Older dances like the waltz and foxtrot were safe, respectable, and involved maintaining proper distance between partners. New dances like the Charleston, the black bottom, and various jazz-influenced steps involved more energetic movements, closer contact, and improvisational elements that horrified conservatives. Churches denounced them. Schools banned them. Parents worried that this new dancing would corrupt their daughters. But young women loved the new dances precisely because they offered freedom. You could move energetically, express yourself through movement, and experience music in your entire body rather than just gliding sedately around a ballroom. The Charlestons kicked legs and swinging arms, the shimmies vibrating shoulders. These movements were joyful, exuberant, and liberating. They were also scandalous because they drew attention to women's bodies in motion, emphasized physicality over refinement, and suggested women were having fun rather than performing propriety. The invitation ritual remained strictly gendered. Men asked, women waited. A woman who approached a man to request a dance was considered forward, desperate, or loose. The proper behavior was to sit or stand attractively, hoping to be noticed and selected. If no one asked you to dance, you smiled gracefully and pretended not to care, even though being a wallflower was humiliating. If too many men asked, you had to manage your dance card carefully, distributing dances to avoid showing favoritism while also not offending anyone. Dance positions were scrutinized for propriety. In traditional ballroom dances, partners maintained several inches of distance. You could see daylight between them, as the saying went. The man's hand rested lightly on the woman's back.
Her hand rested on his shoulder or arm.
Bodies didn't press together. That suggested sexual impropriety. Married couples could dance more closely, but even then, excessive closeness was considered poor taste in public. The newer dances complicated this because some required closer contact or more physical coordination, creating ongoing debates about what was acceptable. The dancing itself had to balance energy with control. Too stiff and you looked uptight. Too wild and you looked unrefined. The ideal was controlled grace, energetic enough to show you were enjoying yourself, restrained enough to demonstrate your good breeding. Your facial expression mattered too, pleasant and engaged but not ecstatic. Laughing too loudly while dancing suggested you were too uninhibited. Looking too serious suggested you weren't fun. Performance requirements extended to every aspect of the experience. Clothing added another layer of complexity. Dancing in the restrictive clothing of earlier eras had been nearly impossible, which partly drove fashion changes toward shorter hemlines and less restrictive garments. But even 1920s. Dancing clothes had rules. Hemlines could be shorter for dancing but not too short. Dresses could be more form-fitting but not tight. The freed arms and legs that made new dances possible also created new opportunities to expose too much, move too provocatively, or otherwise cross invisible lines of respectability. Modern comparison. Imagine if every time you went dancing you had to wait passively to be chosen, couldn't dance too enthusiastically without being labeled trashy, had to maintain exact spatial measurements between you and your partner, and everyone was watching to see if you'd cross any of dozens of unwritten rules. It's like dancing with an invisible panel of judges scoring your movements for technical merit and moral compliance. The generational divide over dancing was really a proxy for larger anxieties about women's freedom, sexuality, and changing social norms. When conservatives condemned the Charleston, they weren't just critiquing dance steps, they were expressing fear about women's increasing independence, about integration across racial lines. Jazz was black music, about the erosion of traditional values. Dancing became a symbolic battleground. For individual women, this meant navigating between desire and propriety. You wanted to dance, to move freely, to enjoy the music and the social experience. But you also needed to protect your reputation, to avoid being labeled as a certain kind of girl. The compromise many women struck was context-dependent behavior. More restrained dancing with family or at conservative venues, more energetic dancing with peers or at more progressive gatherings. They code-switched with their bodies, adjusting their movement to match the social expectations of different spaces. The dance floor offered a taste of freedom, music, movement, social mixing, physical expression. But that freedom came with constant monitoring, both external and internalized. Even in moments of joy, women had to track their behavior, moderate their enthusiasm, and ensure they weren't crossing lines that could damage their reputations. Dancing wasn't just recreation. It was another test, another performance, another opportunity to succeed or fail at the endless project of being a properly feminine woman in a society determined to control every aspect of their existence. Powder room was code for the bathroom because saying bathroom was vulgar. Women excused themselves discreetly, never announcing where they were going or why. Once inside, they were expected to freshen up quickly, repair makeup, smooth hair, adjust clothing, but never linger. Taking too long suggested digestive issues, which were absolutely not discussed, and reapplying makeup had to be done privately. Touching up in public was scandalous. Even basic bodily functions required elaborate social choreography. The terminology itself revealed the anxiety around bodily functions. You didn't say, "I need to use the toilet" or "I'm going to the..." Such direct references to elimination were crude. Instead, you used euphemisms. "I need to powder my nose." "I must freshen up. Excuse me for a moment." Or simply, "If you'll pardon me." The phrasing suggested you were attending to your appearance rather than addressing basic biological needs. The fiction was maintained that women didn't actually use toilets. They merely visited powder rooms to maintain their grooming. The excuse itself required proper delivery. You didn't announce it to the entire room. You caught the hostess's eye or leaned slightly toward your conversation partner and murmured discreetly. You didn't offer explanations or apologize profusely. The ideal was to slip away so smoothly that people barely noticed your absence. Drawing attention to your departure was almost as bad as announcing your actual purpose. The powder room itself was both utilitarian and social. In homes, it was typically a small room off a hallway or near the main entertaining spaces. Close enough for convenience, far enough for privacy.
In nicer homes, powder rooms were decorated to be pleasant, with small mirrors, perhaps a chair, decent lighting, and amenities like hand towels and soap. In restaurants and hotels, ladies' lounges often included seating areas separate from the toilet stalls, creating spaces where women could rest, repair, or escape social situations momentarily. The time limit was real but unspoken. A quick trip, 5 minutes maximum, suggested normal grooming maintenance. Longer absences sparked speculation.
Were you ill?
Having digestive problems? Emotional distress. Women developed efficient routines, use the facilities quickly, wash hands, check hair and makeup in the mirror. Make necessary adjustments and return.
Lingering suggested something was wrong, even if you were simply enjoying a moment of solitude. Makeup application was the powder room's socially acceptable function, while applying makeup in public view was scandalous, touching up. In the powder room was expected. Women carried compacts, small portable powder cases with mirrors that they could use discreetly. A woman might excuse herself multiple times during an event to powder her nose, each time checking and adjusting her appearance. This was acceptable vanity, unlike public primping, which suggested insecurity or excessive concern with appearance. The powder room offered temporary escape. At a difficult social event, women could legitimately excuse themselves, breathe for a few moments in private, and compose themselves before returning. It was one of the few spaces where women could legitimately be alone, away from constant social performance. This made powder room visits serve psychological functions beyond their stated purpose. Modern comparison. Imagine if you had to use elaborate code words every time you needed the bathroom, and people timed your absence and judged you if you took too long, and you couldn't admit what you were actually doing in there.
It's like bathroom breaks becoming intelligence operations requiring careful planning, execution, and cover stories. The gendered aspects were stark. Men's restrooms were straightforward. They were bathrooms, toilets, lavatories. The language was direct. Men weren't expected to pretend they didn't have bodily functions. Women's facilities were powder rooms, terms that emphasized grooming and rest rather than elimination. This linguistic difference reinforced broader fictions about women's bodies, that they were decorative rather than functional, refined rather than animal, concerned with appearance rather than survival. Group powder room visits were common and socially acceptable. Women often excused themselves together, going in pairs or small groups. This served multiple functions: safety in numbers when navigating public spaces, opportunity for private conversation away from men, and social bonding. The powder room conversation became its own genre. Frank discussions that happened between women away from male ears. Reputations were made and destroyed in powder rooms. Advice was given. Secrets were shared. The powder room became a backstage area where women could briefly drop their social masks. The infrastructure itself reflected class and context. Wealthy homes had dedicated powder rooms for guests, separate from family bathrooms. Middle-class homes often had one bathroom that served all functions. Working-class homes might have outdoor toilets or shared facilities. Public accommodations varied wildly. Nice restaurants had attendants in the powder room. Less fancy establishments had basic facilities. The quality of the powder room you accessed reflected and reinforced your social position. The powder room culture embodied the broader contradiction of 1920s femininity. Women had bodies with needs, but admitting those needs was unladylike. So elaborate social fictions were constructed, euphemistic language, time limits, grooming. Justifications, all designed to acknowledge biological reality while maintaining the pretense that proper women barely had bodies at all. Even the most basic human functions became opportunities for performance, judgment, and the endless, exhausting work of being acceptably feminine. Giving and receiving gifts had strict protocols. A woman never gave an expensive gift to a man unless they were engaged. It suggested impropriety. Accepting a gift from a man required careful consideration. Was it too personal, too expensive? Would accepting it obligate you in some way? Thank you notes were mandatory, but they had to strike the right tone. Grateful but not gushing, warm but not intimate. Every gift was a social calculation, a transaction wrapped in ribbon and manners. Gift-giving was never simple generosity. It was communication through objects, a complex language of obligation, affection, and social positioning. The rules governed what you could give to whom, what you could accept from whom, and how you acknowledged gifts received. Violating these rules could damage reputations, create awkward social situations, or send messages you didn't intend. The gender dynamics were particularly restrictive. A man could give a woman small, relatively impersonal gifts, flowers, candy, books, without scandal, assuming they had an appropriate relationship, family, acknowledged courtship, or friendship.
but expensive gifts, jewelry, clothing, perfume crossed lines. Accepting such gifts suggested you were accepting deeper obligation, possibly even romantic or sexual commitment. A woman who accepted expensive gifts from a man not her fiancé or husband was considered compromised, possibly bought. Women giving gifts to men faced even stricter limitations. Handmade items were safest. A knitted scarf, an embroidered handkerchief, baked goods. These suggested domestic skill and thoughtfulness without impropriety. But store-bought gifts, especially expensive ones, were questionable. They suggested either that the woman was pursuing the man inappropriate forward behavior or that she had inappropriate amounts of money and independence. The safest option was often to give nothing at all or to give only to male family members. Among women, gift-giving was slightly more flexible but still governed by hierarchy and relationship. Gifts to social superiors had to be modest. Overly expensive gifts suggested you were trying to buy favor or didn't understand your place. Gifts to equals could be more substantial, but had to be appropriate to the relationship. Gifts to subordinates, servants, for instance, were expected at certain times, Christmas, weddings, but had to maintain proper distance. Generous enough to show benevolence, not so personal as to suggest real friendship. The occasion mattered enormously. Wedding gifts had their own complex protocols. What you gave depended on your relationship to the couple and your economic status. Birthday gifts for adults were less common than now. Elaborate adult birthday celebrations were somewhat novel. Christmas was the major gift-giving holiday, with expectations about who gave what to whom. Hostess gifts when visiting someone's home were expected but had to be thoughtful without being excessive. The presentation mattered almost as much as the gift. Items had to be wrapped appropriately, plain paper for modest gifts, finer paper and ribbon for more expensive ones. The wrapping itself communicated care and attention. A carelessly wrapped gift suggested the giver didn't value the recipient. An overly elaborate wrapping could seem like compensation for a disappointing gift inside. Receiving a gift required its own performance. You opened gifts gracefully, without tearing paper frantically or showing too much excitement. Your facial expression had to show appreciation without excessive emotion. You thanked the giver appropriately, warmly but not effusively for most gifts, with more restrained gratitude for gifts from relative strangers or superiors. Then came the mandatory thank you note within 24 to 48 hours, written carefully to acknowledge the specific gift and express appropriate gratitude. Modern comparison. Imagine if every gift exchange required complex calculations about appropriateness, obligation, and social messaging, and getting it wrong could damage your reputation or create uncomfortable social debt. It's like every present being a legal contract that you have to analyze for hidden clauses before accepting. The rejection of gifts was sometimes necessary but always awkward. If a man gave a gift that was too expensive or too personal, a woman might have to refuse it to protect her reputation. This required extreme delicacy. You couldn't simply hand it back and say, "This is inappropriate." Instead, you expressed gratitude for the thought, explained gently that you couldn't possibly accept something so generous, and returned it with grace. The man was supposed to understand and withdraw the gift without offense, though this didn't always happen. Gift-giving created complex webs of obligation. Receiving a gift generally obligated you to reciprocate eventually, at appropriate times and with appropriate items. The reciprocation couldn't be immediate. That suggested you wanted to discharge the obligation quickly. But couldn't be delayed too long. That suggested you'd forgotten or didn't value the relationship. Tracking these obligations required mental accounting of who gave what to whom when, ensuring proper balance over time. The economic burden could be significant. Maintaining appropriate gift-giving practices required money that many women didn't control directly. Married women often relied on household budgets managed by husbands. Unmarried women living with parents had limited access to money. Yet the social expectation to give gifts to hostesses at weddings for Christmas remained. Women developed creative solutions. Handmade gifts, shared gifts from multiple people, or carefully budgeted purchases spread throughout the year. The underlying message was about women's economic dependence and social vulnerability. Expensive gifts from men were dangerous because they suggested obligation. If he gave you jewelry, what did he expect in return? The anxiety around gift acceptance reflected broader truths about women's economic position. They couldn't easily reciprocate expensive gifts because they often didn't control money. Accepting such gifts created debt that couldn't be repaid in kind, only in intangible currencies like gratitude, attention, or possibly sexual favor. Every wrapped box was a potential trap, and women had to navigate gift-giving with the wariness of people who understood that even generosity could be a form of control. Fainting was practically an art form for 1920s women, though by this decade it was starting to fade. Still, appearing delicate was valued. Women were expected to look as though they might faint at any moment from the sheer burden of their refined sensibilities. Corsets helped with this by actually cutting off circulation. If you did faint, it had to be gracefully, a gentle swoon into the nearest chair or conveniently placed man's arms, collapsing gracefully. Unforgivable, even unconsciousness had standards. The fainting phenomenon was rooted in Victorian culture but lingered stubbornly into the 1920s, particularly among older generations and more conservative communities. The Victorians had practically romanticized female fragility. A delicate woman who fainted at shocking news or overwhelming emotion was demonstrating her refined sensibility. Her nervous system was so sensitive, her constitution so delicate, that her body simply couldn't withstand strong stimuli. This was considered proof of superior breeding and femininity. The physical reality was less romantic. Corsets, which were still worn by many women in the early 1920s despite fashion moving away from them, genuinely caused fainting. Tight lacing compressed the diaphragm, restricted breathing, and reduced oxygen flow. Add in the expectations that women eat small portions, maintain perfect posture, and never appear to exert themselves. You had a recipe for genuine medical events. Women fainted because they were oxygen-deprived, malnourished, and physically constrained. But society interpreted this as feminine delicacy rather than the obvious consequences of idiotic clothing. The proper faint had very specific characteristics. You didn't drop like a stone that suggested a seizure or genuine medical emergency, which was embarrassing rather than romantic. Instead, you swayed slightly, brought one hand to your forehead in a gesture of distress, and sank gracefully downward. If furniture was nearby, you collapsed onto it. If a gentleman was present, you ideally swayed toward him, giving him the opportunity to catch you and support you to a seat. The whole event was choreographed like a ballet. Fainting had social uses beyond genuine unconsciousness. A strategic feint could extract you from an uncomfortable situation, command attention and sympathy, or communicate distress without having to articulate it directly. If a conversation became too scandalous, a delicate woman might faint, immediately shifting focus from the improper topic to her well-being. If a marriage proposal was unwelcome but you couldn't directly refuse, a feint bought time. It was a socially acceptable form of disruption, a way to rewrite the immediate social situation. Revival from fainting also followed protocols. Someone loosened your collar or cuffs, fanned you with whatever was handy, a folded newspaper, a lady's fan, even a hat, and possibly offered smelling salts, ammonia-based compounds that irritated the nasal passages enough to shock you back to consciousness. You revived gradually, with delicate fluttering of eyelashes, perhaps a small moan, and then a confused, "Where am I?" You didn't snap back to full consciousness immediately. That suggested you had been faking. By the 1920s, this was all becoming somewhat passé, at least among younger, more modern women. Flappers didn't faint. They were too busy dancing, smoking, and living energetically. The fainting female became associated with old-fashioned Victorian sensibilities. Progressive women mocked it. Health reformers pointed out that women who wore sensible clothing, exercised and ate properly didn't faint nearly as often. The fainting couch, a piece of furniture literally designed for collapsing delicately, was being replaced with more practical seating. Modern comparison. Imagine if pretending to faint gracefully was considered an appropriate response to uncomfortable situations, and people judged your femininity based on how elegantly you collapsed. It's like performance art meeting medical emergency, where losing consciousness had to be aesthetically pleasing and socially advantageous. The class dimensions were significant. Wealthy women could afford to be delicate. They had servants to do physical labor, corsets tailored to compress them, fashionably, and social schedules that allowed for recovery time after fainting spells. Working class women couldn't afford to faint. They had jobs that required physical stamina, couldn't spare time for theatrical collapses, and often wore more practical clothing that didn't restrict breathing. Fainting, like so many feminine ideals, was a luxury of the upper classes that middle-class women aspired to and working-class women couldn't access. The medical profession was complicit in romanticizing female fragility. Doctors diagnosed women with hysteria, nervous exhaustion, and weak constitutions, rather than recognizing that corsets, restrictive clothing, and inadequate nutrition were causing genuine health problems. The cure was often bed rest, which further weakened women physically and reinforced the idea that they were naturally fragile. It was circular logic. We restrict women's bodies and activities. They become weak. Their weakness proves they need restriction. The decline of fainting culture in the 1920s paralleled broader changes in women's lives. As clothing became less Restrictive as women entered workplaces and universities, as physical activity became more acceptable, women fainted less. Shockingly, when you can breathe properly and move freely, you don't collapse unconscious nearly as often. But the expectation of delicacy lingered even as the fainting couch gathered dust. Women were still supposed to appear fragile, sensitive, and easily overwhelmed. They just weren't supposed to actually faint about it anymore. The performance requirements shifted, but the underlying message remained. Femininity meant weakness, vulnerability, and a body that couldn't quite handle the demands of existing in the world.
What you read said everything about your character. Novels were acceptable, but only certain kinds. Romance, not too racy or uplifting literature. Reading newspapers was tolerated but not encouraged. Women weren't supposed to concern themselves too much with worldly affairs. Reading poetry aloud at social gatherings was encouraged, as long as it
wasn't too modern or controversial. And if you were caught reading something scandalous like birth control pamphlets or suffragette literature, you might as well have announced you're a radical bent on destroying society. The bookshelf was a window into your soul, or at least that's what etiquette arbiters claimed. Proper women read improving literature. Classics, poetry, uplifting moral tales, maybe some history if it was presented in an accessible, non-threatening way. Charles Dickens was acceptable. Jane Austen was perfect, romance and social commentary safely packaged in historical distance. Shakespeare, in carefully selected works, demonstrated education. Religious texts and devotional literature were always appropriate.
Novels required careful selection.
Romance novels were acceptable if they were sufficiently chaste, love stories that ended in marriage with no explicit sexual content. Adventure novels written for general audiences were fine, but sensational novels, anything
with too much violence, sexuality, or moral ambiguity were questionable.
French novels had a particular reputation for raciness and were often forbidden to unmarried women. Russian literature was considered depressing and potentially corrupting, with its focus on suffering and social criticism. Detective fiction and mysteries were gaining popularity in the 1920s but were considered somewhat lowbrow. They were acceptable leisure reading, but not the kind of books you'd discuss at a literary salon. Popular fiction, dime novels, and pulp magazines were definitely beneath a refined woman. If you read them, you did so privately and didn't advertise it. They were the equivalent of modern guilty pleasure reading, fun but not respectable. Newspapers presented a particular challenge. Women were expected to stay informed enough to discuss current events intelligently if asked, but not so informed that they had strong political opinions. Reading the society pages was acceptable and encouraged. You needed to know who was marrying whom, who was hosting what, and other social intelligence. Reading news about fashion, home decoration, and recipes was appropriate.
But poring over political news, financial reports, or international affairs suggested you were overstepping your proper sphere of interest.
Magazines created specifically for women were considered ideal reading material. Publications like Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping offered articles on domestic topics, fashion, etiquette, and light fiction. Everything a woman supposedly needed to know without venturing into inappropriate subjects. These magazines reinforced traditional gender roles while offering practical advice and entertainment within acceptable boundaries. Forbidden reading was extensive and revealing. Anything explicitly about sexuality was absolutely taboo. Margaret Sanger's birth control pamphlets were not only scandalous but potentially illegal to possess.
Suffragette literature arguing for
women's rights was radical and concerning to conservative families. Socialist or communist writings were dangerous. Even scientific texts could be questionable. Medical books, biology texts, or anything that discussed human anatomy too explicitly might corrupt feminine innocence. Poetry occupied an interesting middle ground. Reading and appreciating poetry was considered refined and feminine. Many women memorized poems and could recite them at gatherings. This demonstrated education and cultural refinement. But modern poetry, especially the more experimental or sensual works, was questionable. Anything too passionate, too physical, or too challenging to traditional values was inappropriate for feminine consumption. Modern comparison. Imagine if your entire character was judged by your Kindle history and reading the wrong things could get you socially ostracized or labeled as morally suspect. It's like having content filters applied not by algorithms but by your entire community, with real social consequences for consuming unapproved material.
The library question was significant. Public libraries were becoming more common, offering working and middle-class women access to books they couldn't afford to buy.
But librarians often acted as moral gatekeepers, steering female patrons toward appropriate materials and away from controversial or unsuitable texts. Some libraries had separate reading rooms for men and women, with different collections available to each. Reading in public also had rules.
A woman reading alone in a park or cafe was somewhat suspect.
What was she doing there by herself? Why wasn't she at home? What was she reading?
Reading was safer as a domestic activity done in the privacy of home or in appropriate social contexts like book clubs or literary societies. But even book clubs had to be careful about their selections, avoiding anything too controversial that might attract negative attention.
Education complicated things. College-educated women had been exposed to broader literature, philosophy, and political theory. They'd read texts that conventional society considered inappropriate for women. But they had to be careful about displaying that knowledge. Being too educated could make you unmarriageable. Men supposedly preferred women who were pleasant companions rather than intellectual equals. So educated women often downplayed their reading, hiding their knowledge to appear appropriately feminine. The underlying message was about controlling women's minds and imaginations. If you controlled what women read, you controlled what they thought about, what they aspired to, what they believed possible. Limiting reading material to domestic topics, romance, and uplifting moral tales kept women focused on traditional roles and conventional morality. Forbidden literature, books about women's rights, sexuality, political radicalism offered alternative visions of what women could be and do. The gatekeeping of reading material was ultimately about gatekeeping possibility itself,
ensuring that women's imaginations remained safely confined within the narrow boundaries society had constructed for them. Every woman carried a handkerchief always. It was for dabbing tears but never sobbing, for delicately patting your forehead, never wiping sweat, and for covering your mouth when you coughed or laughed too hard. Lending your handkerchief to a man was considered intimate. Accepting his was even more so. The handkerchief had to be clean, pressed, and monogrammed if you could afford it. Pulling out a wrinkled or stained one was mortifying. This tiny square of fabric carried the weight of your entire reputation. The handkerchief was one of the most essential accessories a woman carried. It lived in your pocket, your sleeve, or your handbag, ready for deployment at any moment. Unlike many aspects of 1920s etiquette that were purely performative, the handkerchief actually served practical purposes, but those purposes were wrapped in layers of social meaning and strict usage protocols. The material and quality mattered enormously. Linen was ideal, absorbent, soft, and refined. Cotton was acceptable for everyday use. Silk handkerchiefs were for show more than function, often too delicate for actual nose-blowing. The edges might be hemmed simply or decorated with lace or embroidery. Monogramming, having your initials embroidered in one corner, was a mark of refinement and also prevented handkerchief mix-ups. Though it also made it obvious if you lent yours to someone else. The size and folding method communicated care and attention. A properly maintained handkerchief was folded into a neat square, never wadded or crumpled. Some women folded them into triangles or rectangles, depending on how they would be carried. The fold had to be crisp, suggesting you'd recently laundered and pressed it, which in turn suggested you were well-maintained and organized. A rumpled handkerchief emerging from your pocket suggested slovenliness. Usage protocols were specific and gendered. Women used handkerchiefs to dab tears delicately, one or two gentle touches to the corner of each eye. Actual crying with streaming tears and nose-blowing was done as privately as possible. If you had to cry in public, you held the handkerchief to your face, covering your expression and catching tears. But you didn't sob or wail. The handkerchief created a small shield between your emotional distress and public view. Coughing and sneezing required handkerchief coverage. You brought it quickly to your mouth and nose, muffling the sound and containing any spray. The act had to be swift and discreet. Loud, uncovered sneezes were vulgar. After using the handkerchief for this purpose, you folded it carefully to hide the used section before returning it to your pocket. No one wanted to see the evidence of your bodily functions. Dabbing perspiration was perhaps the handkerchief's most delicate use. Women weren't supposed to sweat. They glowed or perspired delicately. Using a handkerchief to pat your forehead, the back of your neck, or your temples was acceptable if done subtly. But wiping sweat aggressively or, God forbid, revealing visible sweat stains on your clothing suggested you'd been exerting yourself inappropriately or were too physically active. The handkerchief helped maintain the fiction that your body remained cool and composed even in uncomfortable conditions. The exchange of handkerchiefs was loaded with romantic and social meaning. If a woman dropped a handkerchief, a gentleman retrieved it and returned it. This was basic courtesy. But if she deliberately dropped it near an attractive man, it was a classic flirtation technique, giving him an excuse to approach and speak to her. Accepting the return of your handkerchief required appropriate gratitude and perhaps a brief conversation, which was the entire point. Lending a handkerchief created intimacy. If a woman was crying and a man
offered his handkerchief, accepting it was significant. It meant allowing him to witness your vulnerability and accepting comfort from him. The handkerchief would need to be laundered and returned, creating an obligation for future contact. This made the handkerchief exchange a romantic gesture in novels and real life. It established connection and implied future interaction, modern comparison. Imagine if everyone carried a small piece of fabric that communicated your social class, hygiene standards, and organizational skills, and the way you used it was constantly scrutinized for signs of impropriety. It's like if tissues became status symbols with complex social protocols attached to every sneeze. The economic dimension was real. Quality handkerchiefs were expensive, and you needed multiple ones. Fresh handkerchiefs daily if you wanted to maintain standards. Laundering them was labor-intensive, requiring careful washing, starching, and ironing to keep them crisp and white. Wealthy. Women had servants handle this. Everyone else either did it themselves or let their standards slip, which was immediately visible when you pulled out your handkerchief.
Monogramming added cost, but also personalization.
Your initials marked the handkerchief as distinctly yours, which was practical, preventing loss or mix-ups, but also vanity, announcing your identity on even this small item. Monogrammed handkerchiefs were often given as gifts, an affordable but personal present appropriate for various occasions. The handkerchief also served as a prop in social interaction. A woman could fidget with her handkerchief nervously, twist it in her hands during tense conversations, or use it as something to do with anxious energy. She could fan herself with it delicately. She could drop it deliberately to attract attention. Like the parasol and gloves, the handkerchief became an extension of social performance, a tool for communication beyond words. The decline of handkerchief culture came gradually with the rise of disposable tissues. But in the 1920s, the cloth handkerchief was still essential. It was a small square of fabric that carried enormous symbolic weight about cleanliness, preparedness, refinement, and the constant maintenance required to present yourself as an acceptable woman. Even your method of catching tears or covering sneezes became another element of performance, another opportunity to demonstrate that you'd mastered the endless, exhausting details of feminine propriety. How you entered and exited a room mattered. Arriving at a party too early suggested you were over-eager or had nothing better to do. Arriving too late was rude, unless you were of high enough social standing to make a fashionably late entrance. Leaving required equally careful timing. Too soon and you insulted your host. Too late and you overstayed. When you did leave, you had to say goodbye to everyone of importance individually, with the right level of warmth, but not so much. A motion that you seemed desperate to stay. Every entrance and exit was a performance. The timing of arrival was a complex calculation involving social status, the type of event, and unwritten but universally understood rules. For a dinner party with a stated start time, you arrived within 15 minutes of the specified hour. Not before, not significantly after. Arriving early suggested you had nowhere else to be or didn't understand social timing. It also inconvenienced the hostess, who might still be preparing. Arriving too late meant food was waiting, other guests were delayed, and you disrupted the carefully planned evening. For afternoon teas or receptions with a time range, 3 to 5 p.m., you had more flexibility, but timing still communicated messages. Arriving at the beginning suggested eagerness. Arriving at the very end suggested you were fitting them in between more important engagements. The sweet spot was somewhere in the middle, suggesting you'd prioritize the event. Fashionably late was a privilege of status. If you were an important guest, someone of high social standing, a celebrity, or the guest of honor, arriving slightly late was acceptable and even expected. Your late entrance created a moment, allowed others to notice and acknowledge you, and reinforced your importance. But this only worked if you actually had the status to pull it off. Anyone else arriving late was just rude. The entrance itself was choreographed. You didn't burst into the room enthusiastically or slink in trying not to be noticed. You entered with calm confidence, pausing briefly in the doorway to allow others to notice you, scanning the room to locate the hostess, and then moving purposefully toward her to offer your greeting. Your coat and hat were removed in an entrance hall or foyer, not in the main gathering space. Arriving still bundled in outerwear suggested you weren't planning to stay long. Greeting the hostess was mandatory and had to be done correctly. You approached her directly, offered warm thanks for the invitation, perhaps complimented some aspect of her home or appearance, and then moved aside to allow others to greet her. Monopolizing the hostess's time at the entrance was rude. Other guests needed to greet her too. But failing to greet her at all was insulting and would definitely be noticed and remembered. Movement through the party required social navigation. You circulated, spending appropriate amounts of time with different groups and individuals. Clinging to one person all evening suggested social anxiety or limited social skills. Flitting around too rapidly suggested nervousness or social climbing. The ideal was graceful circulation, joining conversations, contributing appropriately, and moving on smoothly without a fuss. The exit was even more complex than the entrance because it involved extracting yourself without seeming rude or eager to leave. The first rule was that you never left early unless you had a legitimate previously mentioned excuse, prior engagement, early morning obligation. Leaving within the first hour of a party was insulting unless you'd specifically told the hostess you could only stay briefly, but staying too late was also problematic. As the evening wound down, guests were expected to read social cues, the hostess stifling yawns, servants beginning to clean up, conversations becoming sparse. When you decided to leave, you first made a discreet round of important goodbyes, thanking the hostess effusively, saying farewell to anyone you'd had significant conversation with, and perhaps offering brief farewells to others. You didn't announce to the entire room that you were leaving. That might trigger a mass exodus. The goodbye to the hostess was critical. You found her, expressed gratitude for the lovely evening, complimented something specific, the food, the company, the entertainment, and made your exit without lingering too long in the doorway or having extended goodbye conversations that blocked other departures. Modern comparison. Imagine if every time you showed up to or left from a social event, you were being graded on timing, social awareness, and your ability to read unspoken cues, and failures were discussed at the next gathering. It's like social interactions becoming timed exams where you can fail by arriving or leaving at the wrong moment. The coat and hat retrieval was another small performance. You didn't rummage through the coat closet yourself. A servant helped, or at larger events you'd received a coat check ticket. You redressed in the entrance area, not the main room, completing your transformation from guest back to outdoor traveler before stepping into the night. Group exits could be awkward. If you came with others, you needed to coordinate your departure without being too obvious about it. Couples leaving together was straightforward, but if a group was ready to leave and others weren't, you had to manage the departure diplomatically, perhaps suggesting reconvening elsewhere without implying the current party was boring. The day after protocol was also part of the exit. The mandatory thank you note had to be written and delivered promptly, closing the social loop that began with the invitation. The exit wasn't really complete until that note arrived at the hostess's home, confirming that you'd appreciated the evening and maintained proper social form. The underlying anxiety was about belonging and acceptance. Arriving at the right time proved you understood social codes. Exiting appropriately proved you could read subtle cues. Both demonstrated that you belonged in this social stratum, that you'd internalized the unwritten rules, that you were one of them. Mistakes in timing or execution marked you as an outsider, someone who didn't quite fit, who might not be invited back. Every entrance and exit was a test you couldn't afford to fail. Another performance in the endless theater of acceptable femininity and social propriety. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed, wearing whatever you want, crossing your legs however you please, take a moment to appreciate just how far we've come. The women of the 1920s navigated a world where every smile, every step, every breath was monitored and judged, where your ankle could be scandalous and your handkerchief could ruin your reputation, where you couldn't eat, sit, speak, or even grieve without following elaborate rules designed to keep you small, quiet, and controlled. They lived in corsets that restricted their breathing, under social codes that restricted their freedom, within a system that told them their primary value was being decorative, obedient, and marriageable. Every day was an exhausting performance, managing your posture, your voice, your appetite, your emotions, your very presence in the world. A single misstep could damage your reputation. A bold choice could brand you as. And yet, despite all of it, they survived. They laughed. They loved. They found ways to be human within impossible constraints. And then slowly, stubbornly, courageously, they began to break free. They cut their hair, they shortened their skirts, they danced energetically and spoke their minds. They crossed boundaries that had been considered sacred for generations. They refused to shrink anymore. And in doing so, they didn't just rebel, they rebuilt. They created space for the women who came after them to breathe more freely, to move more easily, to exist more fully. We owe them so much. The right to wear comfortable clothing, the ability to eat in public without performing delicate bird impressions, the freedom to speak our opinions without wrapping them in apologetic qualifiers, the simple dignity of having bodily autonomy, of controlling our own movements, expressions, and choices. Every freedom we take for granted was hard won by women who were told no, who were judged. harshly, who risked everything to push back against a system designed to contain them. So yes, the etiquette rules of the 1920s were absurd, suffocating, and designed to exhaust women into compliance. But they also show us something important, that resistance is always possible. That change happens when enough people refuse to follow unjust rules, and that freedom is built by individuals making small, brave choices that add up to revolution. Tonight, cross your legs at the knee if you want, laugh as loudly as you feel, speak your mind without softening every opinion. Eat with gusto, take up space, be imperfect, authentic, and unapologetically yourself, because you can. Because women fought for generations so that you could. And now, as the evening deepens and the last echoes of 1920s etiquette fade into the soft hum of your modern world, let us pause for one final reflection. Because the story of these women is not just a catalogue of absurd rules and exhausting performances. It is a story about something deeper, about what happens when a society decides that half its population must spend their lives shrinking, apologizing, and performing. The women of the 1920s were not weak. They were not fragile, despite everything their clothing and their manners tried to tell them. They were, in fact, remarkably strong. They had to be. Every day required a level of self-discipline and emotional labor that would exhaust most modern people in a week. They managed their smiles, their postures, their voices, their appetites, their facial expressions, their very presence in space. They remembered who outranked whom and adjusted their curtsies accordingly. They wrote thank you notes by hand, dozens of them weekly, each one a small masterpiece of social calculation. They navigated conversations where saying the wrong thing could damage their reputations for years. They wore clothing that restricted their breathing and deformed their bodies. They carried parasols and gloves, handkerchiefs, each with its own rule book. They fainted gracefully when the occasion demanded it, which was more often than anyone liked to admit because their corsets were literally starving their brains of oxygen. And yet, within this suffocating system, they found ways to be human. They laughed in powder rooms where no men could hear them. They exchanged glances that said everything the rules forbade them to say aloud. They danced the Charleston when they thought their mothers weren't looking. They rolled down their stockings and cut their hair and voted and worked and loved and rebelled in 1,000 small ways that added up to something enormous. The 1920s were not just an era of flappers and jazz. They were an era of transition. The old rules were dying, but they were dying slowly, and in the meantime, women had to live in the awkward space between what had been and what was becoming. They had to smile without showing their teeth, even as they voted for the first time. They had to wear gloves indoors even as they entered professions their grandmothers could never have imagined. They had to curtsy to social superiors even as they earned their own paychecks and controlled their own money. The tension was exhausting, and yet they endured. Let us sit with that word for a moment. Endured. It sounds passive, like something that happens to you rather than something you do. But endurance, in the context of 1920s womanhood, was anything but passive. It was active, conscious, daily resistance. Every time a woman chose to follow a rule she found ridiculous, she was making a calculation. Is this battle worth fighting? Is this the hill I want to die on? Sometimes the answer was yes, and she pushed back, shortened her skirt, spoke her mind, refused to curtsy. Sometimes the answer was no, and she played along, saving her energy for fights that mattered more. Both choices required intelligence, self-awareness, and a clear-eyed assessment of the world she lived in. Women who survived the 1920s with their sanity intact were not the ones who followed every rule perfectly, nor were they the ones who broke every rule spectacularly. They were the ones who learned to read the room, to know when to push and when to yield, to conserve their strength for battles that might actually be won. They were strategists, survivors, pragmatists. They were also dreamers, rebels, and revolutionaries. They contained multitudes, as women always have. Now, as we prepare to close this long journey through the etiquette of a bygone era, let us consider what these women might think of us. If they could see us now, sitting in our comfortable clothes, crossing our legs however we please, laughing without covering our mouths, speaking our minds without wrapping our opinions in apologetic qualifiers, what would they say? Would they be shocked? Perhaps a little. The flappers of the 1920s were already pushing boundaries, but even they could not have imagined a world where women wear pants to formal events, where a woman can be a CEO or a senator or a Supreme Court justice, where the idea of a proper lady has become almost quaint. But I think they would also be proud, not because we have achieved perfection, we haven't, not because sexism is over, it isn't, but because we have made progress, because we have taken the small freedoms they fought for and expanded them, because we have continued the work they began, chipping away at the walls of expectation and assumption that have confined women for centuries. The 1920s woman who shortened her skirt by 2 inches was making a statement. The 1920s woman who voted for the first time was making history. The 1920s woman who went to college, who worked outside the home, who spoke at a public meeting, who refused to faint when she was perfectly capable of standing up for herself. She was laying the groundwork for everything that came after. She was not perfect. She was not always brave. Sometimes she followed the rules because it was easier, because she was tired, because the cost of rebellion was too high. But she was there. She was present. She was living through a moment of profound change, and she was doing her best to navigate it. And that perhaps is the most important lesson of the 1920s. Not that the rules were absurd, though they were. Not that women were oppressed, though they were. But that human beings, even under the most restrictive circumstances, find ways to be themselves. They find cracks in the system and slip through. They find allies in powder rooms and dance floors and voting booths. They find joy in forbidden laughter and secret rebellions. They survive. They endure. They persist. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the images of the 1920s fade gently. Let the corsets and gloves and parasols dissolve into the dark. Let the curtsies and thank you notes and carefully modulated laughter become distant echoes. What remains is not the rules, but the women who lived under them. Their courage, their cleverness, their quiet determination to be more than the world wanted them to be. They were not perfect. They were not always kind to each other. They were products of their time with all the limitations that implies, but they were also human, and their humanity shines through the sepia photographs and the etiquette manuals and the faded memories of a world that no longer exists. We carry their legacy with us, whether we know it or not. Every time a woman speaks without apologizing, she is channeling the suffragettes who marched for the vote. Every time a woman wears comfortable shoes, she is channeling the flappers who kicked off their heels and danced the Charleston. Every time a woman refuses to make herself smaller for someone else's comfort, she is channeling every woman who ever looked at an impossible rule and decided, not today. The 1920s are gone, the women who lived through them are gone, but their spirit remains. It lives in the way we walk, the way we talk, the way we refuse to be silenced. It lives in every small act of rebellion, every time we choose authenticity over approval, every time we decide that our comfort matters more than someone else's. Expectations, so sleep well tonight. Let the past be past. But carry with you a quiet gratitude for the women who came before. They wore corsets so you could wear yoga pants. They wrote thank you notes so you could send a quick text. They curtsied so you could shake hands as equals. They fainted gracefully so you could stand tall. They did not have it easy. They did not have it fair. But they had it, and they handed it to us, and we have made it something more. The work is not finished. It never is. But tonight, for this moment, we can rest. We can breathe. We can be grateful. And we can remember that even in the most absurd and suffocating of times, there is always room for resistance, for joy, for the quiet, stubborn insistence on being fully human. Good night. Sleep deeply. Dream of a world where rules are made to be questioned, where expectations are not obligations, where women can be exactly who they are without apology. That world is not here yet, but it is closer than it was. And it is closer because of them, and because of us, and because of everyone who refuses to shrink. Now, let the candles burn low. Let the fan hum its soft, steady song. Let the night wrap around you like a blanket, warm and safe and full of possibility. The 1920s are over. The rules have changed, and you tonight are free. Free to be comfortable, free to be yourself. Sleep well. And thank you to all the women who came before for making this moment possible. Your corsets are off, your gloves are in the drawer, your parasols are folded away. Rest now. You have earned it. But wait, there is more. Because the story of women and etiquette does not end in the 1920s. It continues, evolves, transforms. The rules change, but the game remains. And if we look closely, we can see the echoes of the 1920s in our own lives. In the subtle ways we are still asked to shrink, to perform, to be agreeable, to take up less space. Consider the modern workplace. How many women have been told they are too aggressive for speaking directly, too emotional for showing passion, too ambitious for wanting to advance? The language has changed, but the underlying message is the same. Be pleasant, be agreeable, don't make waves, don't take up too much space. Sound familiar? It is the 1920s all over again, just with different costumes. Consider social media. How many women curate their online presence carefully, presenting a version of themselves that is polished, likable, non-threatening? The performance continues, just on a different stage. The stakes are different, perhaps. No one will be socially ruined for posting the wrong thing, though it sometimes feels that way. But the pressure to perform, to manage your image, to be seen as nice and approachable and unproblematic is as real as ever. Consider the beauty industry. The corset has been replaced by shapewear, the parasol by SPF, the gloves by hand cream. But the message is the same. Your body needs improvement. Your natural state is not enough. You must spend time, money, and energy making yourself acceptable to the world's gaze. The tools have changed, but the project remains. Consider the way women are still expected to manage emotions, theirs and everyone else's. How many women have been told to smile more? How many have suppressed their anger, their frustration, their perfectly legitimate rage because expressing it would make them difficult or hysterical? The 1920s woman who learned to modulate her voice, to keep her laughter contained, to never show strong opinions, she is still with us. She is us. We have inherited her training, even if we no longer wear the corset. The etiquette of the 1920s was not just about manners. It was about control. It was about keeping women small, quiet, and manageable. And while we have made enormous progress, while we have won battles that the women of the 1920s could only dream of, the war is not over. The rules have changed, but the game remains, and we are still learning how to play it on our own terms. So tonight, as you rest, take a moment to appreciate how far we have come. But also take a moment to recognize how far we still have to go. The women of the 1920s did not fight so that we could simply trade one set of constraints for another. They fought for freedom. Real freedom. The freedom to be ourselves without apology, without performance, without shrinking. We owe it to them to keep fighting. To question the rules, even the ones that seem natural. To refuse to perform when the performance is draining. To take up space, to speak our minds, to laugh as loudly as we want, to wear what we want, to be who we are. Not because we are perfect, but because we are human. And because the women who came before us deserve to see that their struggles were not in vain. So sleep well tonight. Rest your body and your mind. Tomorrow, the work continues. But tonight, you are free. Free to be comfortable. Free to be yourself. But let us go even deeper. Let us sit with the question of why these rules existed in the first place. Why were women expected to smile without showing their teeth, to laugh without being too loud, to speak without expressing strong opinions? Why were their bodies corseted, and their movements restricted, and their voices modulated? The answer is not simple, but it is revealing. At its core, the etiquette of the 1920s was about maintaining a social order, a hierarchy, a system in which men held power and women were expected to support, to defer, to please. The rules were not arbitrary. They were functional. They kept women focused on their appearance and their social performance, which left less time and energy for education, careers, political activism, or any other pursuit that might challenge the existing power structure. A woman who is constantly worried about her posture, her smile, her gloves, her thank you notes, her handkerchief, her handshake, her curtsy, her perfume, her hat, her parasol, her voice, her laughter, her appetite, her ankles, her crossing of the street, her sitting position, her entrance and exit, her conversation topics, her reading material, her gift-giving, her fainting technique, her powder room visits, her telephone manners, her dancing, her clothing, her makeup, her hair, her skin, her body, her every movement and expression and word is a woman who has no energy left to challenge the system that created all those rules in the first place. It was brilliant, in a terrible way. The system was self-perpetuating. The more energy women spent on performing femininity correctly, the less energy they had to question why they needed to perform at all. The rules kept them busy, anxious, and compliant. They were too exhausted to rebel, but they rebelled. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, steadily, in 1,000 small ways. They shortened their skirts. They cut their hair. They smoked cigarettes in public. They danced to jazz. They went to college, they entered the workforce. They voted, they spoke out. They refused to faint, they refused to be small. The rebellion was not perfect, it was not complete, it is not complete, but it was real, and it changed the world. The women of the 1920s were not just following rules or breaking them. They were navigating a transition, a liminal space between the old world and the new. They were learning in real time how to be women in a society that was rapidly changing. They made mistakes, they were inconsistent, they were sometimes complicit in their own oppression, but they were also brave and clever and determined. They were human. And that perhaps is the most important lesson of all. Not that the rules were bad, though they were. Not that women were victims, though they were. But that human beings, even under the most restrictive circumstances, find ways to be themselves. They find cracks in the system and slip through. They find allies in unexpected
They find joy in forbidden acts.
They survive, they endure,
They persist.
The etiquette of the 1920s is gone. The corsets are in museums. The gloves are in costume trunks. The parasols are decorative curiosities. But the underlying pressures, the expectations, the performance, they are still with us. They have just changed shape. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the images of the 1920s fade gently. But let the questions linger. What rules are you following that you never chose? What performances are you performing that drain your energy? What would it mean to stop? To refuse? To be yourself, unapologetically, without the constant self-monitoring, without the endless calculations of what is proper and what is not? The women of the 1920s did not have the luxury of asking these questions. They were too busy surviving. But we do. We have the time, the space, the safety to reflect. And we owe it to them and to ourselves to use it. So as you close your eyes tonight, take. Let go of the rules that do not serve you. Let go of the performances that exhaust you. Let go of the need to be perfect, to be agreeable, to be small. You are not a 1920s woman. You do not have to curtsy or modulate your voice or worry about your ankles. You can laugh as loudly as you want. You can speak your mind. You can take up space. The women who came before you fought for that freedom. Not all of it, not perfectly, but some of it. Enough of it. Enough for you to rest tonight without worrying about whether your sleeping position is ladylike enough. Sleep well. Dream deeply. And when you wake, carry with you a quiet gratitude for the women who wore corsets so you could wear whatever you want, who wrote thank you notes so you could send a quick text, who curtsied so you could shake hands as equals, who fainted gracefully so you could stand tall. They did not have it easy. They did not have it fair. But they had it, and they handed it to us, and we have made it. Something more. The work is not finished. Tonight, for this moment, we can rest, we can breathe, we can be grateful. Good night. And now, as the night deepens and the silence settles, let us return one final time to the women themselves. Not as symbols or cautionary tales, but as human beings. Women who woke up each morning to a world that told them they were not enough, and who somehow found the strength to face it anyway. Women who laughed in powder rooms and cried in private and danced when no one was watching and survived. Think of the young woman in 1925, standing in front of her mirror, adjusting her cloche hat at just the right angle. She is nervous about the party tonight. She has rehearsed her smile, her posture, her conversation topics. She has chosen her gloves carefully. She has powdered her nose and applied just a hint of rouge. She is ready, but she is also tired. Tired of the performance, tired of the rules, tired of being watched and judged. She goes because that is what you do. She goes because there is joy in it too. The music, the dancing, the laughter, the connection. She goes because despite everything she is alive and she wants to feel it. That woman is not so different from us. She wanted what we want, to be seen, to be loved, to be free. She did not have the words for it, perhaps. She did not have the vocabulary of feminism and empowerment, but she felt it. She felt the weight of the rules and the thrill of rebellion. She felt the exhaustion of performance and the joy of authentic connection. She was human. Fully, complicatedly, beautifully human. And so are we. The rules have changed, but the game remains. We are still navigating expectations, still performing, still managing the gap between who we are and who the world wants us to be. But we have something the women of the 1920s did not have. We have history. We have their example. We have the knowledge that the rules can be broken, that the system can be changed, that small acts of rebellion add up to revolutions. Let us stay in that quiet space a little longer. Let the night deepen around us. The candles have burned low, and the only light now comes from the soft glow of your screen or the dim lamp beside your bed. The fan hums its gentle, steady song. The world outside is still, and inside we are alone with our thoughts and with the echoes of a time that no longer exists. The women of the 1920s are gone. Their voices have faded into the static of history. Their photographs are yellowing in albums. Their dresses are preserved in museums. Their etiquette manuals gather dust on library shelves. But something of them remains. Something that reaches across the decades and touches us if we are willing to listen. What was it like to be them? To wake up each morning and face a world that had already decided so much about who you were supposed to be. To put on your corset and your gloves and your hat. To check your smile in the mirror. To rehearse your conversation topics, to steel yourself for another day of being watched and judged and measured against standards you did not create and could not control. It must have been exhausting. It must have been lonely. It must have been at times unbearable. And yet they did it. Day after day, year after year. They got up. They got dressed. They went out into the world. They smiled when they were supposed to smile, laughed when they were supposed to laugh, spoke when they were supposed to speak, and kept silent when they were supposed to keep silent. They performed, and then they came home, took off their corsets, and collapsed. We do not know what they thought in those private moments. We do not know what they said to themselves in the mirror when no one was watching. We do not know what they dreamed of, what they longed for, what they would have changed if they could. The historical record is silent on the inner lives of ordinary women. We have their letters, sometimes their diaries occasionally, but most of what they felt, most of who they were, is lost to us forever. And yet we can imagine. We can imagine the relief of unlacing a corset after a long day, the pleasure of taking off your gloves and feeling the air on your bare hands, the joy of kicking off your heels and wiggling your toes, the simple, profound luxury of being alone, of not performing, of just being. Those moments must have been precious. They must have been the thing that kept them going, the small oasis of freedom in a desert of obligation. Think of a woman in 1925, sitting alone in her bedroom after a dinner party. The guests have gone home. The dishes are being washed in the kitchen. The house is quiet. She sits at her dressing table, unpinning her hat, removing her jewelry, unlacing her corset. She sighs, a long, deep sigh that seems to come from somewhere far down inside her. She looks at herself in the mirror. Not the performed self, the public self, the one who smiled and nodded and made pleasant conversation. The real self,
the one with tired eyes and sagging shoulders and a face that has finally stopped performing.
What does she see? What does she think? We cannot know. But we can imagine that she feels something. Relief, perhaps. Exhaustion, certainly. Maybe a flicker of pride that she got through another evening without a major faux pas. Maybe a small regret about something she said or didn't say. Maybe a quiet longing for something more, something different, something she cannot quite name. And then she goes to bed, she sleeps, and tomorrow she will do it all again. This was the rhythm of life for women in the 1920s. Not dramatic, not heroic, not the stuff of movies and novels. Just the daily, grinding work of being a woman in a world that wanted you to be smaller than you were. The work of smiling when you wanted to scream. The work of being agreeable when you wanted to argue. The work of being pleasant when you wanted to be honest. It was not right. It was not sustainable. And yet they did it. They did it because they had to. They did it because the alternative was worse. They did it because they were strong, even when they were not supposed to be. And slowly, over time, they began to push back. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but in small, persistent ways. A skirt hem raised an inch. A strand of hair cut short. A cigarette smoked in public. A vote cast. A boundary crossed. Each small act of rebellion was a brick in the wall of change. Each woman who refused to perform, who refused to shrink, who refused to be what the world wanted her to be, made it a little easier for the women who came after. We are those women. We are the ones who came after. We are the beneficiaries of their courage, their stubbornness, their refusal to accept that the rules were permanent. We owe them a debt we can never fully repay. But we can honor them by living fully, by being ourselves. By refusing to perform when the performance is draining, by taking up space, by speaking our minds, by laughing too loudly and crossing our legs at the knee and wearing what we want and being who we are. This is not a small thing. This is everything. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the images of the 1920s fade gently, but let the gratitude remain. Gratitude for the women who wore corsets so you could wear yoga pants, who wrote thank you notes so you could send a quick text, who curtsied so you could shake hands as equals, who fainted gracefully so you could stand tall. They did not have it easy. They did not have it fair. But they had it, and they handed it to us, and we have made it something more. The work is not finished. It never is. But tonight, for this moment, we can rest. We can breathe. We can be grateful. Sleep well. Dream deeply. And when you wake, carry their legacy with you. Not as a burden, but as a gift. The freedom to be yourself. The freedom to take up. The freedom to laugh too loudly, to speak your mind, to wear what you want, to live authentically. That freedom was hard won. Honor it by using it. Good night.